Olá, tudo bem? Bom dia.
Hello, good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm Adriana Couto, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you today. A pleasure to be in this important webinar, The Frontiers of Assessment, sponsored by the Lemann Foundation with the support of OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and ABAV, the Brazilian Association of Educational Assessment. For 30 years ago, Brazil launched Saeb, the National Elementary Education Assessment System. The objective is to assess the quality of elementary education provided by Brazilian schools since 1995. The adoption of a methodology called IRT, Item Response Theory, allows for the comparison of Saeb results over time. Today, we can assess the development of education provided to our children and teenagers on Portuguese and math at the end of every education cycle, elementary and high school. A careful assessment that is conducted every 2 years and that has become an international reference. Since 2005, it has allowed us to calculate EDAB, the Elementary Education Development Index, for every school, city, and state. In 10 years, that indicator in Brazil went up 30% in elementary education, 24% in middle school, and 15% in middle school in public schools. But it's still short of what our students deserve. Besides, regional differences among schools and students are quite significant, and the situation is even worse for those in a situation of social vulnerability. What's important about EDAB is that today we can see a history of over a decade of a lot of work. But these lessons learned should help us make progress, especially after we launched our first Common Core and everything we are experiencing in education during the pandemic. After all, after at least 7 months away from our schools, we need to restart and do better. This is a very timely moment for our discussion on the assessment we want for the future. We know that the way we assess can influence, inform, and support the right to learn. Therefore, this morning we will debate the development of a diagnostic, formative, and summative assessment system and how to improve it to prepare our students to face the challenges of this century. To speak about such an important topic, we will have 3 panels today. The topic of our first panel will be High Expectations for the Common Core, assessing higher skills and competencies, with experts from the OECD, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Federal University of Minas Gerais. The topic of our second panel will be assessment as an ally of our students, managers, and teachers as schools reopen, with experts from OECD, the Education Secretariat of Pernambuco, ABAV, and the Reúna Institute. And to close our debate, we will have the presence of INEP, that we will speak about the future of our national assessment, Saeb. And before I turn it over to our guests that will open our event, I would like to show you a video on the role and challenges of assessments today in Brazilian education. Let's check it out.
As escolas estão totalmente fechadas e os
atualizou a
alunos em
situação
casa.
da doença no país.
Um novo recorde de mortes.
O Brasil tem 105 mil casos confirmados.
Surto de coronavírus
É a maior pandemia mundial em séculos.
são 9.146 mortes ao ano.
Falo para 2 ou 3?
A gente aprendeu muitas
a se adaptar às novas situações.
E o mais
We
difícil
learn to adapt to the new situations. Distance is difficult, it's not the same thing. The tool I use to participate in those classes involve my cell phone. It's not as fast as it was. There are some very supportive teachers, and they are there for everything. Whenever you need them, they are available. Even on the other side of the screen, teachers explain very well. Sometimes you'll wake up eager to learn something new. I think they should pay more attention to us because whether you want it or not, it's very difficult. Sometimes I feel discouraged knowing that it will take too long to finish. My parents help me a lot. It's hard for me to ask for their help, but they do help me as they can. You have been incredible in my life. I will miss this school, miss people. To be there, present, everyone together. The impacts of the pandemic in education. A study conducted by Datafolio has shown that the public school networks look for alternatives to non-essential school activities. From May to July, the pedagogic content went up significantly for students with some pedagogic content. But inequality is a determining factor for those in public schools that had no access to distance learning. For the teacher to know where they have to restart, they have to know where children stopped. That's very important. And we have to use that diagnostic assessment tool in order to support schools reopening. We want to be safe as schools reopen, and we want to mitigate the problems caused by the pandemic in education. We cannot give up the right to learn. The diagnostic assessment plays a very important role to recognize students' weaknesses, what they haven't learned, the strategies schools need to adopt for students to catch up, how to rethink our assessment methods. It may help us move ahead. A standardized summative assessment is important because it allows us to monitor performance over time. And IRT is in the very basis of Saeb. And the first time it was applied, it was in 1995. From an assessment standpoint, Saeb advanced little. Now we have the new BNCC, our common core. We have to assess higher skills, and we have to evolve from a test that was only multiple choice to a test that has open-ended questions. In IRT, we have targets to work on quality indicators, combining the two assessments. We have a responsibility with our managers to define targets and direct public policies that will help that schools in offering quality education. We need to move away from only reading and math. The Common Core is contributing to create a system. BNCC promotes overall skills, not just normative skills. We have process and formative assessments that are important for us to truly achieve the purpose of our Common Core. So the current model is no longer useful, but what should the new models look like? They have to undergo a teacher training process involving also managers. I wanted to have classes in the lab. I learned to be patient. I think the biggest lesson was to learn in a different setting.
Capaz de influenciar, informar e apoiar a garantia de direitos de aprendizagem. É tempo de rever conteúdos, elaborar novas práticas e iluminar caminhos a serem desbravados na educação. Vamos juntos?
As escolas estão...
Pois bem, vamos sim. Essa é a nossa reflexão hoje. E para fazer a abertura desse nosso webinário, eu convido Camila Pereira, diretora de Educação da Fundação Lemann.
Muito obrigada, Adriana. Bom dia a todas e todos. É uma alegria muito grande para a Fundação Lemann a gente receber todos vocês aqui hoje nesse seminário internacional para a gente poder discutir as fronteiras da avaliação, né? Olha, eu fiquei muito feliz de ver as alunas, de ver os professores nesse vídeo de abertura agora, né? Eu sinto que sempre que a gente se reúne assim para discutir um tema importante para a educação, como é o caso das avaliações, acho que é fundamental que a gente tenha em mente aqueles que estão em sala de aula todos os dias, né? Os nossos estudantes, os nossos professores. E acho que esse vídeo, ele resume bem também o nosso objetivo com esse encontro de hoje. A gente quer celebrar o sistema de avaliação que o Brasil construiu nessas últimas décadas, né? E os avanços que isso trouxe para a educação brasileira, e ao mesmo tempo provocar a gente a pensar o que pode ser o futuro e a evolução desse sistema de avaliação. Bom, mas antes de entrar de vez no tema de hoje, eu quero só fazer uma breve rodada de agradecimentos aqui. Eu quero começar agradecendo especialmente a presença de cada um de vocês que se dispôs a estar aqui com a gente hoje, nessa manhã de segunda-feira, né? Já são 7 meses aí que essa pandemia virou a nossa vida de cabeça para baixo, que a gente não participa de nenhum grande evento como esse presencialmente, né? Então, eu confesso que eu estou morrendo de saudades de um evento presencial. Até da fila do credenciamento eu estou com saudade. Mas eu acho também que é muito bacana que a gente, de alguma maneira, tenha se reinventado aí, aprendido a fazer esses encontros e debates tão importantes também no espaço virtual, né? Eu acho que o lado positivo é que a gente consegue reunir bem mais gente. Então, hoje a gente já está aqui nesse momento... não sei se eu atualizei aqui ainda, mas estava com cerca de 350 pessoas que a gente tem aqui acompanhando a gente de todas as regiões do Brasil. Eu fico vendo no chat aqui passar o pessoal dando oi de tantos lugares, tantos estados e cidades brasileiras. E acho que de acordo com o número de inscritos, a gente vai ter mais gente ainda se conectando aí com a gente ao longo do seminário. Então, obrigada pela presença de todos. E eu quero também agradecer e cumprimentar nossos parceiros nesse evento, claro, a OCDE e a ABAV, que são 2 organizações referências no tema de avaliação, né? Então, em nome do André Schleifer, eu cumprimento aí todo o time da OCDE, agradeço muito pela parceria com a Fundação Lemann, que tem sido super importante. Agradeço também a professora Maria Helena, presidente da ABAV, todos os pesquisadores associados da ABAV que vêm trabalhando há décadas aí nessa qualificação das avaliações no Brasil, né? E agradeço ainda ao presidente do INEP, Alexandre Lopes, que vai fechar o nosso evento aqui hoje. Muito obrigada, Alexandre, por você conseguir encaixar na sua agenda esse debate tão importante. Então, dada a relevância e o protagonismo do INEP, essa conversa toda aqui só faz sentido com a participação de vocês. E, por fim, claro, quero agradecer também aí a participação hoje e a confiança de sempre os nossos queridos parceiros do Concede da Undime, a professora Cecília, o professor Luiz Miguel. É uma honra sempre para a gente poder contar aí com a presença de vocês nesses encontros. E aí, gente, muito rapidinho, por que a gente está aqui hoje discutindo o futuro da avaliação no Brasil e tentando trazer as melhores referências para qualificar esse debate, né? Acho que, como muitos de vocês sabem e conhecem, a gente lá na Fundação Lemann sonha com um Brasil mais justo, com um Brasil mais desenvolvido, né? E para a gente chegar nesse sonho, um pilar super importante tem sido ajudar a garantir uma educação pública de qualidade. Quanto melhor for nossa educação pública, mais a gente, como país, vai conseguir desenvolver o potencial dos brasileiros, mais a gente vai conseguir aproveitar o talento de milhões de alunos que hoje ainda não chegam tão longe quanto poderiam, simplesmente por falta de oportunidades. Então, uma das principais frentes de atuação em educação da Fundação nesse trabalho tem sido justamente o apoio a políticas que impactam a aprendizagem, né? Um apoio para a construção dessas políticas e um apoio também para que elas saiam do papel e cheguem de fato nas escolas e nas salas de aula para apoiar os professores e os alunos. E nos últimos anos, acho que muitos de vocês acompanharam, participaram ativamente, uma política que a gente defendeu muito e para a qual a gente buscou trazer muitas contribuições, foi a Base Nacional Comum Curricular. E a nossa visão, o nosso compromisso, algo que a gente fala sempre desde o começo nesse processo, é que outras políticas, né, a formação de professores, os materiais didáticos e especialmente a avaliação, precisam se alinhar à base para que ela possa realmente ter o impacto desejado. É muito importante que essas políticas sejam coerentes entre si e apontem todas na mesma direção. E aí eu vou usar uma frase que o André Schleicher, da OCDE, né, usou em um evento no Rio, no ano passado, que foi a última vez que a gente esteve juntos, né? Ele estava falando sobre currículo e avaliação, e ele disse o seguinte: quando o currículo e a avaliação brigam, a avaliação sempre ganha. Então, imagina que desperdício se depois de todo o esforço que a gente fez nesse país para construir essa base, que puxou a barra do que se espera que os alunos aprendam, uma base que trouxe as 10 competências, né, para o centro do nosso processo educacional, se a gente desperdiçasse todos esses avanços porque a avaliação não acompanhou o currículo. Seria, eu acho, uma pena, todos nós concordamos com isso, né? Só que a gente tem ouvido de especialistas, e acho que a gente deve ouvir hoje aqui de novo, que esse processo de alinhamento ele não é trivial, assim, não é uma tarefa simples, né? Criar itens capazes de medir competências e habilidades mais complexas como essa que a base traz. Uma coisa é medir domínio de conteúdo e outra é avaliar capacidade de resolução de problemas, capacidade de argumentação, atitude pesquisadora, né? Várias novas dimensões que a base trouxe. Então, justamente porque a gente sabe que esse não é um processo simples, a Fundação Lemann tem tentado apoiar os principais atores que estão aí envolvidos com esse tema hoje no Brasil. Apoiar o INEP, o CONSED, a Undime, apoiar a BAV, o CAED, a SESGRAN Rio, todo mundo que tem se dedicado a tentar pensar como que a gente vai fazer esse alinhamento no Brasil das avaliações e do nosso padrão curricular da nossa base nacional. E aí tem uma série de ações que a gente vem desenvolvendo há alguns anos já nessa frente. A gente levou um grupo de especialistas para a Universidade de Colômbia, lá no Teachers College, onde a gente conversou com alguns dos principais especialistas do mundo nesse processo de alinhamento de avaliação e currículos. Lá surgiram, né, 2 grupos de trabalho, um liderado pela BAV e outro liderado pelo CONSED, que a gente vem patrocinando e que vem se reunindo e produzindo referências muito sólidas desde então. A gente também investiu em trazer uma avaliação que é super interessante para o Brasil nesses últimos anos, que é o Pisa para escolas, que agora a SESGRAN Rio está responsável por aplicar e que a gente acha que pode ensinar bastante para a gente nesse momento também. E agora, por meio dessa parceria aí com a OCDE, com a escuta de muitos especialistas dessa área no Brasil, a gente está realizando esse estudo sobre o Saeb e vai apresentar recomendações práticas, bem concretas, em breve, para ajudar a qualificar ainda mais esse debate no Brasil. Então, eu só queria dar esse contexto geral para dizer que esse seminário é parte de um esforço bem maior que a gente vem fazendo na Fundação, e eu espero muito que ele seja um marco importante aí nesse processo todo. Aí eu acho que se tudo isso que eu estou falando já parecia muito importante antes para a gente, né? Agora, acho que como esse vídeo de abertura bem nos lembrou, né? Com os desafios de aprendizagem que a gente vai enfrentar nesse Brasil pós-pandemia, esse é um trabalho, eu acho, que ganha ainda mais relevância, né? A gente está extremamente comprometido na Fundação Lemann, assim como tantos gestores públicos aqui, organizações da sociedade civil, a trabalhar para mitigar os danos dessa pandemia na aprendizagem dos alunos. Então, todos os esforços agora que a gente puder ter para apoiar políticas que favoreçam a aprendizagem, eu acho que são mais importantes do que nunca, né? Então, eu espero que a gente possa aprender muito hoje com esse debate, com esse rico grupo de panelistas que a gente tem aqui, e que essa manhã seja uma manhã de uma contribuição importante para esse debate no Brasil. Muito obrigada mais uma vez pela presença de todos e um ótimo seminário para todos nós.
Obrigada, Camila. Obrigada pelas palavras. Bom, então agora a gente vai ouvir a Maria Cecília Mota, que é secretária de Educação do Mato Grosso do Sul e presidente do CONSED, Conselho Nacional de Secretários de Educação. Bom dia, Maria Cecília.
Bom dia. Bom dia a todos. É um prazer estar aqui com vocês. Adriana, muito obrigada pela abertura, pela referência, mas eu quero iniciar cumprimentando a iniciativa da Fundação Lemann, no nome da Camila, que tem trabalhado, tem sido parceiro de todos os secretários estaduais e municipais, como também o Andréas e a Maria Helena, da OCDE e da BAB, que são pesquisadores que se aprofundam nesse estudo tão importante no momento em que nós estamos com uma nova BNCC recheada por 10 competências que abrange o cognitivo e o socioemocional, uma base totalmente formada de maneira diferente, com objetivo de aprendizagens por área de conhecimento, no ensino médio por itinerários. Então, há de se debruçar, sim, no novo Saeb, um Saeb que consiga abranger toda essa nova política que nós estamos tendo em relação à educação, toda essa movimentação. Mas falar também que nós estamos num momento muitíssimo difícil, nós enquanto secretários, por isso a importância dessas instituições como a CDE, a BAB, os parceiros do terceiro setor, que têm se debruçado no estudo de aprofundamento em várias políticas, em especial na política de avaliação. Todos nós sabemos o que foi estampado no início do vídeo, o tanto que nós estamos sofrendo, inclusive para avaliar no dia a dia alunos que estão longe da escola, alunos que trabalham remotamente com seus professores, alunos que usam plataformas, avaliações por plataforma, avaliações com material entregue, o tanto que todos os professores estão sofrendo nesse momento. Mas eu quero falar um pouquinho dessa avaliação diagnóstica que nós vamos enfrentar a partir do momento que os estudantes voltarem para a escola. Vários estados, e eu vou dizer o meu também, deixou para o ano que vem as aulas presenciais, apesar de que as escolas estão abertas para tirar dúvidas, abertas para plantão de dúvidas, aberta para o reforço, mas a avaliação diagnóstica no retorno das aulas é um papel fundamental. E o CONSED, na frente de avaliação, que tem uma frente de avaliação, que a Fundação Lemann apoia, está colaborando bastante, inclusive com uma plataforma de apoio à aprendizagem. Isso, para nós, é muito importante. Mas, junto com o CAED, que está ajudando essa frente de avaliação, nós já estamos podendo fazer algumas avaliações diagnósticas de português e matemática, para que os professores, mesmo remotamente, consigam intervir nos objetivos de aprendizagem fundantes, né, aqueles que são os mais importantes, para que o professor consiga, mesmo que remotamente, trabalhar as deficiências dos estudantes. Com certeza, a equidade está muito longe, pelo contrário, a desigualdade na verdade, foi escancarada, mas de qualquer maneira ela está aí posta. Então, nós temos que fazer diagnóstico, avaliar não só a questão cognitiva enquanto gestores, a questão da infraestrutura, porque nós vamos ter que montar uma escola totalmente diferente, tanto fisicamente na questão da biossegurança, como também na maneira nova de trabalhar com o ensino híbrido. A escola vai ter que se reinventar, e aí nós temos um diagnóstico do que é que precisamos de fazer. Fazer um diagnóstico no início, gente, das emoções dos nossos estudantes, das emoções dos nossos professores, no acolhimento dos professores e dos estudantes, há de ter, porque isso vai impactar no cognitivo, na aprendizagem. Nós vamos receber estudantes de todos os tipos, que perderam parentes, que estão com parentes da UTI, que família apanhou, que foram abusados. Esse é um trabalho tão importante quanto a avaliação diagnóstica da aprendizagem da questão cognitiva. As questões socioemocionais deverão estar presentes em cada secretaria de estado de município, em cada escola, em cada professor, para garantir realmente essa aprendizagem. Na verdade, vamos ter que ter uma nova política, assim que voltarmos, uma política de recuperação para minimizar as questões da diversidade dos estudantes, da relação da aprendizagem. Então...
Fala um pouquinho.
Dois. It's a new front, the diagnostic, formative, summative, but I wanted to raise this broader assessment, which will allow us to reopen schools in a safer manner. And I hope the webinar to be very fruitful, that we can all learn a lot from it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria Cecilia. Several challenges ahead of us, and that's what we've been discussing. For that, we need to be together. Thank you. And to wrap up this opening remarks, we'll have Luis Garcia, who is the Secretary of Education of Sudiminuti and the President of the UNGE. Good morning.
Luiz Miguel?
Luis Miguel. Good morning. Good morning. My mic was off, of course, as usual. I'd like to thank you very much to be able to participate. Good morning, Camila, everyone at the Lemann Foundation. This is a very timely moment. This discussion is essential. Assessment has been a transformation lever in Brazilian education. So that's why I say this is a very, very timely moment to discuss. I'd like also to say good morning and say salute Andreas from OECD, and Abavi, Maria Elena, and a big thank you to Maria Cecilia Mota, the president of CONSED. I'd like to go back to a very important issue, which we discussed early on in the pandemic, when we were facing the challenges of organizing and finding ways to provide a more systematic approach to education. Everybody together, third sector organizations, CONSED, BIMI, the Ministry of Education, everybody together, and we all felt a certain anxiety on the part of small cities. What was the reach of our initiatives at the time, whatever initiatives we were talking about, and how we could better understand the validity of what we were doing early on. And then in a second moment, as we prepare to reopen the schools in the future. Facing those challenges, we tried to understand the process. We conducted some surveys to try to understand how schools were being successful or not in outreaching to students from the point of view of city schools. So at the end, At the end of April, we had over 40% of cities with no initiatives whatsoever with students. By mid-August, the number went down to less than 4%. So that shows the hard work that was put in and the very effective monitoring that was put in place. All of that was a driver to improve quality and to allow a closer approach to students. So as we look and think and revisit those issues, we are able to look at the future with a better expectations. As Cecilia said it and said it very well, I don't want to repeat what she said, but lessons we learned around competencies as they link to our common core and how we can expand that as we get ready to reopen schools. And it is a good thing that we have the common core. If we did not have a common core in place right now, we would be able now to be working as we are. Things would be much more chaotic, and the reopening of schools would not expose fundamental issues. So the common core is our main guiding light for assessment right now. It is the very tool that will allow us to ensure that the current school generation will have no gaps in their learning. No easy task, nobody said it was going to be easy, but when we look at the assessment process right now, as we try to understand what's being done, and we try to understand what will be done in the future, all of that will be key. It's also very, very good to see the development of a learning support platform that the Lemann Foundation, CONSED, and CAED put together, other institutes, Reúna, Itaú, Ayrton Senna, all of them helped provide an instrument to allow schools, and I'm talking about city networks, over 5,000 of them, several cities which have very dire infrastructure and which need that kind of support. So that platform, this event, this webinar, Frontiers of Assessment, all of that will help us look at the system from a more critical point of view. We need to know, we need to critically analyze the process, and then we can revisit and rebuild things from a different perspective, and do that on a continuous base. That does not stop. So from that point of view, I want to be here to contribute, and I am sure with that, we'll be able to, as I said, revisit, reorganize the learning process in Brazil. And I have no doubt in my mind that if we can have an efficient assessment process, if we use that process as we build new possibilities, if we are maintaining close contact with families, teachers, teacher training processes, I'd say that in no more than 5 years, we'll be enjoying a more advanced learning process than we would be if we hadn't gone through the process we went through in the past few months. Congratulations to the Lemann Foundation for this event. It's a very timely moment, and I hope we can all enjoy this moment. This is where the key to learning lies, in line with the common core.
And to conclude this opening ceremony, I want to invite Andrea Schleiss, Special Advisor to Political Policies at OECD, to speak about the contribution of assessments for an education that focuses on the challenges of the 21st century. Good morning, Andreas.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Good morning.
Can I have my slides, please, or can you allow me to share my screen? Good. It's a great pleasure to connect with you, and I also must say I'm talking about the Frontiers of Assessment, but But I do believe that actually Brazil is quite close to the frontiers of assessment. I'm actually always very impressed what Brazil has achieved in terms of monitoring, tracking student learning outcomes in a very systematic way. So I think there's a lot of strengths that you can build in designing the future. If you can just click to the next slide, please. This is going to be... we always need to be conscious of the policy objectives. What do we want to achieve with assessment and evaluation? If you can again click to the next slide. This is going to be a very slow process because I can't control my slides for some reason, but we will do our best. We need to understand the policy objectives. We also need to have a good understanding of the context, and can we actually see how that context is going to shape the future, and then think about the kind of reforms and changes that we envisage, to what extent they are technically feasible, to what extent they will be robust and cost effective. Next slide. We need to understand the past and present performance of the education system. Now that's what assessment and evaluation really is about, not to just look at what can be easily measured, but to look at the kind of dimensions that we really want to track. Next slide. And we need to understand the reality of delivery at the front line. Now, when assessment and evaluation produce data, we need to keep in mind what is the capacity of students to absorb data, teachers to absorb data, and school systems to absorb data to actually support improvements. Next slide. We need to be aware that learning is not taking place in isolation. The learners are shaped by the processes that we put around them, the learning environments. Those are shaped by the people who are involved. Those people are susceptible to the kind of incentive structures, the work organizations, the support, and all of that ultimately is shaped by the design, implementation, and alignment of policy and practice. Now that's what we have to deal with at the end. Next slide, please. And there are always many actors involved. We have actors at the system level. We need to look at how the system overall is performing. We need to look at the school and what's happening in the classrooms. We need to ask ourselves, to what extent is evaluation and assessment for purposes of transparency, accountability? To what extent is it for improvement, helping students learn better, teachers teach better, schools to become more effective? And sometimes those objectives are very hard to reconcile. People react very differently depending on the information you are using. We need to think about whether we evaluate the outcomes, whether we evaluate processes, whether we evaluate the inputs. We need to think about the methods that we are using. And also, we need to think about who is best positioned to actually do those things. So there are many actors involved in a good evaluation culture as them, producing meaningful synergies. Next slide, please. We also need to keep in mind when we look at student learning outcomes that the kind of things that are easiest to test and easiest to teach have also now become easy to automate, to digitize, to kind of outsource. The kind of things that evaluation and assessment could most easily capture, namely memorization of facts and figures, that is precisely the kind of things that is becoming less relevant in our education systems. The future is going to reward more complex ways of thinking, the more complex ways of working. The modern world no longer rewards you just for what you know. Now, Google knows everything, but for what you can do with what you know. And that commands entirely new learning experiences. Learning experiences where students cannot just listen to the results of an experiment, but do that experiment in a virtual kind of laboratory. So technology is becoming a very, very important driver to make learning experiences more real, more relevant, more authentic, and that in turn requires assessment to reflect those kinds of nuances. Next slide, please. Here on this chart, you can see, to succeed on the most difficult Pisa tasks, for example, in our international Pisa assessment, memorization will not help you. In fact, it can be counterproductive. For the most complex tasks, memorization tends to hinder learning. Next slide. If you want to see sort of what kind of cognitive processes are most important to actually help people succeed on complex tasks that require, mathematical reasoning, mathematical thinking, complex problem design, it's about elaboration strategies, not memorization strategies. And that's something that we need to reflect in the way we design assessments, that we capture those kinds of processes that are most important for the future of education. Next slide. Next slide, please. We have also looked at the mindset questions. We see, for example, in the PISA assessment where students have a growth mindset, where they see themselves as owners of their learning processes. Typically, learning outcomes are better in those education systems. Where students have a fixed mindset, they do not believe that they can engage with this. They cannot own their kind of learning outcomes. They're all fixed by social background, by their genes. You can see learning outcomes are not very good. So basically, the mindset is something that modern assessment needs to help us capture as well, not just the learning outcomes in themselves. Next slide, please. We could see, for example, that students with a stronger growth mindset were more likely to be motivated to master complex tasks. They had a greater sense of self-efficacy. They were less afraid of failure. They were more likely to establish ambitious learning goals. And they also could see more value in schooling itself. So you can see questions of mindset are no longer just nice to have, but they are an integral part of learning outcomes. We need to find ways to capture them as we try to do in the context of PISA. Next slide, please. And then that brings me to assessment and exams. Actually, now technology enables us to actually model very complex exam tasks. First of all, assessment is becoming adaptive. Like in PISA, we no longer give every student the same test. We give students a test that is actually adapted to their relative strengths and weaknesses, so we can zoom in to actually capturing what is relevant for a student. Assessments also allow us to use new types of simulations and games where students can actually solve complex problems, interact with other students. Those kinds of possibilities are now available. We have also now assessments in simulated settings, particularly in vocational education and training, where medical students can do an operation and the computer will assess them rather than just talking about an operation. So again, assessment and exams see a huge and rapid evolution towards 21st century learning. Next slide, please. Classroom analytics are the complement to this. Now, if you go to classrooms in some of the regions in China, you will find lots of sensors in the classroom, and teachers get real-time information on the kind of problems that individual students are good at, not so good at, where they get bored, where they get really interested. So teachers have real-time feedback on, they can see a window into 40 students learning. And those kinds of classroom analytics enable teachers to adapt pedagogy to different students. They know when they need to give special support to a student. They know when they can advance to the next instructional task and so on. So classroom analytics is becoming another important facet of modern assessment and evaluation in the formative sense. Next slide, please. Here's an example. I watched a primary school class in Shanghai where they learn calligraphy, and that's one of the biggest headaches for teachers there, because students need to learn 4,500 characters. Often in the Western world, we struggle with, 26 characters. So you can imagine it's a huge task for teachers to actually build that understanding for those characters. And it's not just the techniques, it's an art. So while students were drawing the characters on the paper, Anna in their table was actually collecting real-time data about the quality of their drawings and then giving them feedback on their mobile phone or tablet. So the students got interactive feedback on the quality of their drawings, and when they were happy with their drawings, they pressed the green button and went to the teacher. The teacher could look at it and then, get big data out of this. Next slide. And then at the end of the lesson, or during the lesson, the teacher had real-time information on the activities of different students and could therefore see sort of where students had common misconceptions, where students, so basically you could see assessment as something that helps students learn better, that helps teachers to teach more effectively. And next slide, and then at the system level, policymakers could connect the data from different classrooms, different schools, and then use that kind of information to redesign curriculum, redesign pedagogical practice. That's really what the future is about, of classroom analytics combined with assessment practices. Next slide. And then, robotics is another example where students often, now can design code in a coding lesson, and then they can have robots actually playing this out. We're also seeing social robots that take on the role of teacher aides, tutors, peers, providing feedback to students. And that's still perhaps more in its infancy, but don't discount the future of those kinds of technology to strengthen evaluation and assessment and the feedback that students need. Next slide. And the last point I want to make is to a blockchain. One of the big limitations of assessment is that they are very lumpy. Now, they're very high stakes. We learn and learn and learn, and then suddenly comes the big day of the test, the exam. And that's a drawback, because often it raises the stakes unnecessarily, and also it creates, huge, like in Brazil, the Saeb, the security arrangements for this are very significant. But actually, with blockchain technologies, we should be able to overcome those limitations in the future, because we can actually look at learning, smaller chunks of learning, capture them in more granular way, and add them up to get the global picture, rather than putting everything into the end of school examination. Next slide, please. So when I look at some of the lessons from high performers, I think it's very important to be rigorous in whatever we do. Now, the rigor teaching fewer things at greater depths, at working at a very high level of cognitive demand, also in the exams and assessment, is very, very important. Adaptive assessment will help us in this. Coherence is important. I very much value the effort in Brazil to actually track student learning outcomes very systematically, to assess students at every grade and accumulating that information to allow teachers, to give teachers good tools actually to see how students are progressing. But again, if you do that, you need to ensure that your assessments are compatible, that you can actually measure individual student growth, so not just synthetic kind of differences. It's important to remain true to the disciplines, to have assessment and evaluation that focuses on individual disciplines, but also to encourage interdisciplinary learning. In Pisa, we do that already. We have many problems that require students to look at the problem from different disciplinary lenses, because that's what the future is about. Innovation will be about connecting the dots where the next innovation comes from. Focusing on areas that have a high value of transfer. Students learn something in one area and then can apply that in another context, in another area, is very important. Authenticity, for students to have the feeling that the assessment tasks are real, that they are problem-based, project-based, sometimes co-created. Now, that's very important. And last but not least, always be aware that some things are caught, not taught. Now, the kind of social and emotional dimensions that become increasingly important, the COVID crisis just highlights this, they're harder to capture in traditional forms of assessment. We need to become more innovative and find ways to capture those dimensions as well. Like just a few days ago, the OECD published the Pisa assessment of global competency. That was an example where social and emotional components played a very, very important role, and we were able to capture some of them in the assessment. But that's a difficult task, because those things are very, very hard to sort of measure and quantify in traditional ways. That's all I wanted to share with you. I think there is a lot that we can do to make our assessments and examinations more oriented towards the future, so that they actually support teachers in advancing the frontiers, in being more innovative in their teaching, rather than just conserve existing teaching practice. Obrigado. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. Muito bom ouvir o futuro da educação, a educação do futuro.
Very good to hear about the future and about the role educators will play in the future. Thank you, Andreas. Thank you so much for your time. Well, now, before we start the panels, I'd like to share another video clip with you about the importance of assessment and the main functions, the main raison d'etre of assessment processes. As the Common Core has been approved, and with the approval of reference curriculum put together in a collaborative effort of states, Brazil has established learning rights which are common to all students. Assessment play an important role to ensure learning, and for that to happen, they have to be part of the pedagogical process. Assessment allows teachers to diagnose the level of knowledge of the classes, allows them to monitor process, allows them to guide students, and allow them to promote pedagogical interventions. So assessment becomes a permanent practice across the learning process. But how can that be done in practice, in the everyday activities of school, in the classroom? Assessments might be used to support the process in three different ways. Providing a diagnostic, usually conducted early on in the year to assess previous knowledge. It is used to identify priorities and also to guide actions that might support the development of students towards what is expected of them. Formative, conducted on a continuous basis throughout the year, has the objective to guide the learning process, allowing teachers to follow up on students on their progress around expected learning objectives. That function allows teachers to identify lessons that were learned, lessons that were not learned, to provide guidelines, and also to ensure that both teachers and students are able to identify deficiencies, advances, and find strategies to guarantee the learning process. Formative evaluation takes place throughout the learning process and can be adapted as we move along. It is essential in school assessment. Without it, it's impossible to know about the success rate of the course. Summative, it happens at the end of the educational process. It can be a year, a semester, a bimester, and it's focused on the level of domain of certain established objectives that should be learned across a given period. So there is a final summatory or sum total assessment at the end of the period. So it's focused on measuring the results of our learning processes based on general criteria. Its results help verify, classify, and inform. With the new Common Core, school networks have a new reference to base curriculum and assessment alignment. For that, it is essential that all those assessments integrate different competencies and skills which are brought about by the Common Core. Having in mind the challenges presented by the 21st century, we expect students to have a good command of certain abilities and certain skills which are essential for today's world so that they can be successful in their lives. So assessment have to be able to assess skills that involve higher dimensions, such as critical thinking, the ability to solve problems with several solutions, and to distinguish fact from opinion. This year, where the world was hit by the pandemic and where thousands of students were closed, the consequences on learning and development of the students will need to be identified and addressed. Assessment practices gain more relevance within this adverse context. They become an important ally for us to understand what schools are facing. Only through assessment processes which are precise and systematic will we be able to support students and teachers in prioritizing curricula, pedagogical intervention, and learning validation as we move across the challenges offered by pandemic and consolidating a permanent learning cycle.
Vamos começar então com...
So let's start with our first panel, high expectations around the Common Core, assessing higher skills and competencies. Here with us, Mario Piacentini, the author of the restructuring of global competencies and critical thinking for OECD, Chico Soares, former president of INEP and an educational researcher, and Ximenes Ejeda, a specialist in education from the Inter-American Development Bank and a former director at the Colombian Institute for Assessment. To facilitate the conversation, I would like to invite Alicia Ribeiro, Executive Secretary for the Movimento para a Base group. Good morning, everyone.
Os slides.
Okay, so I was asked to speak about the Pisa experience in assessing higher order thinking skills, and in particular, critical thinking and creative thinking. Let me start by giving you a little bit of context and motivation for assessing these important skills. Next slides, please. In a recent poll, Pew poll, about half of the adults population in the United States declared that they will not take a vaccination against COVID-19. And we know that vaccination is really the most likely way out we have from this current crisis. And we need a vaccination rate of about 60 to 90%. Next slide. And this is not just a problem of the United States. There have been many conspiracy theories that have circulated about the origin of the virus. For example, one that was very popular online said that the cause of the COVID crisis was the new 5G technology for internet. And it led several young people to attack mosques in several countries, including the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. Next slide, please. So we know that the current pandemic we are all experiencing is highlighting a crisis in public decision-making in the face of increased polarization of fears and high uncertainty concerning the facts. The crisis has also shown the importance of being extremely flexible and adaptive when confronting problems that could not be anticipated. Next slide. And in this context, schools have a big role to play. In order to democratize access to these decision-making capabilities, we need schools that give the students experiences for being able to identify credible information and credible expertise. Moreover, schools need to engage students in those experiences that let them think outside of the box and help them solve the big challenges of today. So we need a combination of critical thinking and creative thinking in order to give students the instruments to become effective agents of change in the current world. So the question is, how do we assess critical thinking and creative thinking? I'm going to give you in the next minutes, quite quickly, some references, some suggestions based on the Pisa assessment of reading, of global competence, and of creative thinking. Let me start from reading. As you know, the Pisa assessment of reading is quite a complex endeavor. It essentially assesses students on three processes. The first process is called locating information. The second process is about understanding. And the third process is about evaluating and reflecting. And this third process is really connected to what we mean by critical thinking, because in those tasks, we are assessing students on their capacity to assess the quality and credibility of information, to reflect on the content of this information, and to detect and handle conflicts in a test. And what we have seen from the data, that those tasks that require students this capacity of evaluating and reflecting are also those tasks in which the students show greater difficulty, where students struggle to find the right responses. For example, as you know, we report Pisa scores according to levels, and most of the references we make to critical thinking in Pisa are associated with level 5 and level 6 of the reading competence. And we know that across the Pisa population, only 1 out of 10 students are capable of performing at level 5 or at level 6. So there is a real shortage of critical thinking. Next slide, please. So reading assess critical thinking in general. What we have done with global competence, the innovative assessment in Pisa 2018 that Andreas mentioned, is to try to assess critical thinking in a specific context, that is global issues and intercultural issues. Global competence, as Andreas said, is a very complex, multidimensional construct, but the first 2 dimensions are really related to the student's capacity to examine critically information. The first dimension of global competence is called examine local, global, and intercultural issues. And in that dimension, we assess student capacity to combine knowledge with critical reasoning to establish an informed opinion about an issue. In the second dimension, that is called understand and appreciate the perspective and worldviews of others, we assess to what extent students are capable of recognizing that perspectives and behaviors are rooted in the speaker context, in its culture, in its origin, and to recognize the influence of this context and on the perspective and on the opinions that people express. So in the test of global competence, we create scenarios in which, for example, 2 people debate about the possible good responses in response to the COVID crisis, and we ask students to reflect on the content of the debate, also on the interest group that the 2 debating people represent, and to what extent their origin, their context, the interest group they represent influence what people say. So if you compare global competence with reading, the main difference is that we are trying here to contextualize critical thinking in a specific domain, in a specific context. And when we define rubrics for defining what students should be able to do, this contextualization of the assessment allows us to go in greater depth. For example, we can describe what it means to assess the reliability and the relevance of sources in the context of global information, of news. And we can also assess, next slide, please, what it means to take, to have like an advanced level of competence in the crucial skill of being able to recognize somebody else's perspective. And in what we are doing in Pisa, one core element of our work is to generate these rubrics that help to describe what students are able to do at different levels of the competence. The last assessment I wanted to speak about is the Pisa assessment of creative thinking that will be administered in 2022. As the other Pisa assessment, there is a test and a questionnaire. In the test, we focus on 3 core thinking skills. The first one is called generate diverse ideas and focus on students' capacity to think flexibly across domain, providing, for example, different solutions to a writing problem, to an open writing problem, or different ways to solve a scientific problem. The second skill that we assess in creative thinking is what we call generating creative ideas. And here we are assessing student capacity to generate ideas that other students could not think of. we are looking at the originality of students' ideas. The third facet or process that we assess in the new creative thinking assessment is called evaluate and improve ideas. And here we are focusing on student capacity to iterate on ideas, improving them, and finding original ways to improve them. And I mentioned before, like, the importance of assessing these higher order skills in context. And what we are doing in creative thinking is to give students idea generation tasks that are situated in 4 different contexts. The first context is creative writing. The second context is what we call visual expression. We ask students to generate visual artifacts such as logos. The third context is social problem solving. We ask students to solve complex social problems. And the fourth one is situated in the scientific context. We propose students scientific inquiry and engineering problems. And the characteristic of all these problems is that they are very open. They can be solved with multiple solutions. I just wanted to give you like 2 quick examples. This is an example of a possible visual task in creative thinking. We present the students with a context, a food festival, and we ask them to create a logo for this festival. In the second example, we are asking students to work on a big social problem. Next slide, please. The problem of water scarcity. And we are asking them to generate diverse solutions for this big social problem. So essentially, we are giving them open problems that can be solved in multiple ways. I want to conclude with a few recommendations that you can consider. The first one is that critical and creative thinking are essential higher order thinking skills that we need to teach and we need to assess. We know how much assessment influences what gets taught. So if we don't assess critical and creative thinking, then these crucial skills will not be taught. I also wanted to make a second point on the importance of assessing those skills, not in abstract, but connecting them with the disciplines and with the areas of learning that students engage with in schools. It's important to think about what critical thinking means in each individual subject and disciplines. For example, what it means to be critical in science, what it means to be critical in history, how students can be creative in the science, and try to develop rubrics, as I showed in the example of global competence, that reflect the practices that, for example, real scientists or real historians engage with in the discipline. Next slide. Then, as Andreas said, it's important that also we reflect the how we assess. And essentially, both critical and creative thinking are
Tanto o pensamento crítico quanto o criativo
are processes that essentially consist in generating new knowledge and new understanding. And they are best assessed with assessment tasks that are not just multiple choice questions, but let students engage in a process, in an iterative process of knowledge creation. For example, searching through information, trying to challenge their own misconception, and iterate on a solution. So we need to make quite a lot of advancement in the use of more interactive tasks, more extended performance tasks. And then the final point I wanted to make is that no test is good for any purpose. This is a point that Andreas also made. It's important to think carefully about the purpose of the assessment. For example, if it's a summative assessment, low stake like Pisa, or it's a formative continuous assessment that mainly aims to provide information to the teachers. And we need to adapt the assessment, including the assessment of critical and creative thinking, to this context. What we are doing now in my team in Pisa is also to try to extend the type of innovative assessment we are developing for PISA to a formative context. And what we are seeing is that there are quite a lot of changes that we need to make, for example, in what information we choose to report. And there is a lot that we can learn and report on the thinking processes of the students. So this is a broader, we need to invest resources, ideas, and work with real teachers and schools to develop this new assessment and to develop a system of assessment that works not just for summative purposes, but also for formative purposes. We cannot achieve this alone at the OECD. We are working with many partners across the world. In Brazil, we have a very productive partnership with the Instituto Unibanco that is helping us not just to develop this new assessment, but also to test those assessments on the ground with real teachers and schools. And we look forward to working with you. That's all I had to say. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mário. Muito obrigada. Bom, estamos no painel alto.
Thank you very much. This is the panel High Expectations for our Common Core Assessing Higher Skills and Competencies. Now we will listen to Chico Soares, former INEP president and a researcher in education. Good morning, Chico.
Essa foi a pauta que a organização.
So this was the agenda given to me by the organizers, the Common Core, how it challenges us, what it means to assess skills and competencies, and is it possible to move away from the current logic? It's a very interesting topic. Next one, please. Notice that the first thing was the Common Core, BNCC. This is the conceptual model. It's important to say it's the same model of Education 2030 that the OECD is promoting. I put here two different moments, at the school and in life. Obviously, they interact, but I have three major dimensions: knowledge, skills, and I'm using character to think about the moment we are experiencing. What does the Common Core say? That we have to mobilize knowledge and skills and those values that I call character to solve social problems. They are all together. The important idea is mobilization, but you need a repertoire. What repertoire? Let me explain on the next screen. I know this is a busy screen, and I mentioned competencies on top. And then I have two major contributions to competencies: knowledge, as I just mentioned, attitudes and values and culture under character. Under knowledge, I wanted to draw your attention. I mentioned content. I mentioned content in between inverted commas because content suggests something more restricted, but in order to mobilize it, I need a repertoire in terms of disciplines, interdisciplinary repertoire, epistemic, and also procedural. And then skills, and I apologize for using a word in English, but in the educational jargon, ability that we use in Portuguese is not the same as skill. We heard Mario's brilliant presentation when he talked about critical thinking as something vital to make up competencies. This is what life requires. So skill is not restricted. It's a fundamental component. And on the character side, I'm dividing you. Obviously, you need to, in order to be a successful person, you must have curiosity, but we live in a society. So you, at your local and global society, that's why education is there. Next. So education, therefore, has to tell you what will be taught. When I talked about the Common Core, I would like to go back to the Common Core and wonder, what are we going to teach? After that is defined, how am I going to teach after I know what to teach and how to assess? They interact. I mentioned this at the top, the Common Core, and at the bottom, the implementation of the Common Core that we call BNCC. So during the development of our BNCC, well, the Common Core is not a curriculum. So what is a curriculum? We have to take the Common Core and see what are the essential learnings. I have to translate and define that essential learning, giving it substance, moving away from the general definitions. This is a definition of reading. So what do we want? We want students to be able to read and understand a variety of literary and informative texts that are progressively complex. This is a competency. This is a substantial objective. We must decide how children will learn that and how I will assess it. Evidence. I'm speaking about the development of the curriculum. I said that we have to go back to the Common Core. We have to define what is essential to be learned for that subject matter. But we have something that is extremely important. As we need to define the evidence. So this is a fundamental question. What evidence will be accepted to say a student has developed reading competency at an appropriate level in order to be completely part of society? That will define how I will teach and how I will assess. You see that there are different types of evidence. Perhaps the biggest weakness in Brazilian assessment lies in this type of discussion that hasn't been conducted completely. What evidence do we accept as proof of learning? I will speak with more details. Well, the Common Core teaches me what to teach, but what is it to implement the Common Core? First, to understand the learning objectives. At a school, at a network, you have to understand, but not just understand learning objectives. The objectives have to be part of everyone's vocabulary. So to implement the Common Core is to prepare, implement discussions, tasks, and activities that will give evidence of what was learned, that will promote and that will become evidence of what was learned, moving away from the general instructions and going into what is specific. Now we have new objectives with the Common Core, and those objectives have different levels of complexity. Broadly, we have reading. Now I understand what reading is all about, but I've implemented reading. What we miss in our discussion is a greater variety of implementation. It's way too easy to know the general instructions. It's a lot tougher to say, I'll give you an example next. This is how I example. Next screen, please. I'll give you an example. This is an example that I have given to several colleagues. I have conducted exercises. This skill to identify the social function of texts that circulate in different areas of our social life. Your home, your street, your community, your schools, and also in the media. Recognizing who produced that, where it circulated, and who it was meant for. So, what does that skill require the students to do? The skill is telling me that the student should assign a communication objective of the text to determine the intention of the author and to determine the possible stakeholders in that text. That will happen in more than one text. So we've implemented the Common Core if we understand what was meant. And now we have an objective way to put this into practice. So the Common Core is a concept that needs to be anchored, that has to become concrete. but it can only be implemented through concrete activities. And schools need examples. And I wanted to ask Mario, when you gave us those fantastic examples, I thought, well, Brazilian teachers need many of the examples that Mario gave us. Sadly, I'll give you a poor example. This is a skill that we have in high school to identify, select, process, and analyze data, facts, and evidence with curiosity, attention, critical thinking, and ethics. Facts, data, and evidence, respecting four criteria: curiosity, attention, critical thinking, and ethics, with and without digital technology. That skill might represent 96 tasks. Obviously, this will never be implemented because it's so ambiguous that nobody knows what it means. So the discussion of the Common Core is really key, so that it's anchored. If that was done, we would know how to interpret this instruction. And it's very important to hold a public debate. Every public policy must involve a debate for those who have something to say and for those who will be impacted. And I really commend the organizers for this debate. When we see learning objectives in the future, we will be more critical. We have to know what we're talking about. This is just to tell you what Pisa does. This is extremely important. Pisa interprets a scale. In Brazil, we have a hard time learning from Pisa. Scale interpretation is to establish items. It's an item map. Those three smileys on the left, you will see six of the item numbers. If you go back to the Pisa 2000, and then the one in 2009, the two on reading, this map is different because items were different, but there is a scale. So once again, we must be concrete. We have to place items. So our feedback process needs to be based on items. Next one. And besides items, they have to be based on rubrics. Given a question, I have to say what level 1 means of the answer, level 2, level 3, and level 4. This is what we need. When the organizers said, how can we move away from the trap of just teaching for the test? First, you have to interpret the scale. Granted. Secondly, if I have many activities, if I've implemented the Common Core, if in my system I can tell everyone what the evidence is, and the rubric where that evidence is being considered, I've taken a very important step. Next screen. We won't make much progress. This is my last screen? It is. Oh, I'm sorry. We won't make much progress if we remain as we are. And it was very nice to listen to Mario before me because he said we won't go very far if our assessment transforms evidence into trivial evidence. There is nothing wrong with the evidence, but you must have solid evidence. In Brazil, our assessment accepts as evidence to find an isolated fact in a text. Pisa says that you must find information associated with other relevant information. To do that, we must change the type of test we conduct. This is a very critical moment for us. If we heard that we will implement multiple choice tests every year for all schools, the current tests will generate a major crisis in Brazilian education because we will crystallize something that is totally inappropriate for the current times. What is the alternative? The alternative is to look at the Common Core, implement it correctly, and support schools with many activities that truly make sense. This is what I had to say. Thank you very much. And I can't wait for the questions and discussions with Mario and Ximena. Chico Soares, he will come back later on to our Q&A session with our moderator. And we now have more considerations on the topic. Now we will listen to Ximena Duenas, an expert in education from the Inter-American Development Bank and former executive director of the Columbia Institute for Education Assessment. Good morning, Ximena. Good morning. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And thank you for sharing this panel with Mario and Chico. I have some important messages. I don't have a presentation. And they have to do with a path that two countries in Latin America have followed. They have an experience of almost a decade, Chile and Colombia, namely. Chile is a country that has become a reference in assessment for Latin America. And they also have the best results in international assessments, be it ERSE, Pisa, ICCS, TIMS. It always has the best results. We always wonder why. What is Chile doing that other Latin American countries are not doing? So the first thing is they differ because they have a single curriculum. That's the first point. And the second point, they are very patient. The two things that are important to us, we have to keep them in mind because changes in education do not take place overnight. They go from one generation to the next. So Chile has a single curriculum and they have an assessment that is very tied to competencies and is based on what that curriculum teaches. Other countries like Colombia, which is the opposite case, we don't have a single curriculum. We have curriculum autonomy at the school level. So that's a gigantic difference as compared to Chile. And we have a deficiency because what happened is that the Assessment Institute tells what has to be taught. It is as if the reference landmarks became the curriculum, which is also a mistake. I'm not saying that this is something we wanted to have, but this is a fact. And this happens because you need to know the objectives you have, irrespective of the trajectory students follow. You may have curriculum autonomy, but the objective is clear. At the end, students must provide evidence of X, Y, and Z, and not having autonomy and not to have a way to ensure that the objectives were achieved. That's why the assessment becomes what it is today. So I gave you those two examples. We have a window of opportunity, and that's the Common Core. And whenever you have a unified curriculum, obviously they are not perfect the first time round. That's very important. It's a constant learning process on the part of students and also those involved with the design of that system. And an assessment will allow us to have evidence of what was actually implemented. And we'll be able to know if students actually learned or managed to achieve the learning objectives or not. This is very important. From one year to the next, things will not change because the system hasn't changed, and it will take a long while for the system to incorporate that new common core in order to change. Unfortunately, we are experiencing a moment where we have a very different school year. And what is the saddest is that next year is likely to be the same because a change in the calendar year won't change the world of education. So we have the focus maps. And I always wondered, we have the common core, we have the focus maps. There is the essential curriculum, let's put it that way. Do we only need focus maps? And this is something Chile asked. Chile is assessing it right now because that will allow them to work better on the competencies, the higher competencies, that is, critical thinking, as Mario mentioned to us, creative thinking, as Mario mentioned as well, or overall and global thinking, as Mario mentioned. They are equally important. And we also must consider that we don't have one single way to assess that Chico and Mario mentioned. There are different ways to assess. So what I wanted to say is that sometimes measuring or assessing sometimes doesn't change the results, but assessing differently might give us information that will learn from the mistakes and improve, making adjustments to the curriculum, making adjustments to the implementation, or improving because teachers will reflect upon students' results and we will be able to make course adjustments to ensure the objectives are achieved. To me, that's the real value of having the results of an assessment. An excessive number of assessments is not very good. It's just like with the COVID crisis, it's just like you go to the streets and you go to the supermarket and they take your temperature. You go to another store and they measure your temperature again. The temperature hasn't changed. You know, excessive number of measurements won't give you a different results. Won't give you different results. My last point is how can we take the common core and conduct an assessment that will have real value to the students, to the teachers, and to the school system as a whole? This is something we heard in this discussion. In order to measure competencies, we need an integration among the different subject matters because Andreas and Mario mentioned that today in order to develop critical thinking, we have to use the knowledge of different areas in order to solve a problem. And to me, this is what it means to perform assessment by competencies. Use what we learn in different contexts, but that means that teachers have to work together in order to know how students are learning using different areas of knowledge. So there must be a guiding line that students will use. And I would like to conclude just by saying that I think everything that was said is important. We have to think about how assessment will help us adjust the system and how to conduct different assessments. We shouldn't focus on a single assessment type because excessive assessment won't give you a different result. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigada, Ximena.
Thank you, Ximena. I would like to turn it over to our moderator to expand our thoughts and to bring questions from our audience. Alice Ribeiro, Executive Secretary of Movimento Pela Base, who's here with us. Good morning, Alice. Good morning. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I would also like to thank the Lemann Foundation for the invitation to be here with you. And I would like to congratulate OECD and the Lemann Foundation for organizing such a relevant discussion. I would also like to greet my panel colleagues. I admire you so much. And as I was asked, I have a general question to the three of them, because we are running against time. There were very important points that were highlighted by Mario, Chico, and Ximena. I'd like to draw your attention. The first of them is that for the first time, Brazil has a common core and a new high school system. Those are guides for our assessment policies to have a coherent assessment system. The common core raises the bar of learning in Brazil, but it's a bullet. What it brings is an essential step, as Camille said earlier on at the beginning of the seminar. It's an essential step to realign the educational system in Brazil. Curriculum, training, teaching material. And that's important for people to develop and achieve their projects of life, contribute towards society. People should be able to live and transform the world in the 21st century. That's a very important point that was reinforced by all the speakers in the panel, by Camilla, but Schleitler, Cecilia, and Luis Miguel. It's important to draw your attention to the fact that to learn skills and competencies, or higher skills and competencies, this is something that goes beyond memorization. It requires an articulated assessment system with diagnostic, formative, and summative systems that are adapted to the new times and to the demands of education. So Mario, Chico, and Ximena mentioned this. Mario said, no test is good for all purposes. That's very important to remember that. Ximena said, we need different assessments that will give you information on how to consider different learning types. And Chico drew our attention to the type of evidence that we will accept, how to change the type of evidence and the type of test. And there is something mentioned on our chat room. We will have to reshape our assessment system to have data that makes sense. And that's correct. We want to truly meet the needs of our students in the 21st century. And finally, and I will ask the question to our three panel members. It was interesting because the three of you mentioned that reforms are necessary and that we need to preserve trust in the assessment system. And we heard the large-scale national assessment. So we need to be more innovative, capture other higher skills and competencies. So, Professor Tomás Veloso said once that to move away from a multiple choice to open-ended questions is important. I would like to ask Mario, Chico, and Ximena if you could give us your vision. What are the key elements that are necessary to promote that transformation, having a coherent assessment system without losing trust in the results that we achieve? Who would like to start? Alice, who would you like to answer first? Let's follow the same sequence of the presentation. Perhaps we can start with Mario, and then Chico, and Ximena.
Okay, thanks, Alice. This is a very important question. There is not like a straight, like a simple answer to that. I think it's extremely important that that all stakeholders appreciate the content of the assessment. So there has to be full transparency on what gets assessed and how. And you can achieve that by being very explicit in the construction of the assessment. For example, as Chico said, like defining clearly what are the rubrics, what are the claims you want to make about the students, what you consider valid evidence for these claims, and what are the tasks that can actually tap into this evidence. And this is a process that will require time, and in which it's extremely important to engage many stakeholders, including the teachers, so that you don't get the trap of just assessing what is simple to measure. And this connects to your point that you made, like that, yeah, multiple choice, what they actually assess. There are multiple choice that are actually quite good and tap into higher order skills. For me, it's not really too much a question of multiple choice versus like a written extended answer. It's more a question of being able to finally get a sense of what are the things that students can do and cannot do. This is where like technology can help us a lot, because with technology, with the type of assessment we are trying to develop now in our research program, we get evidence on the reasoning process. We know that some tasks are more complex and require sustained complex thinking process. But for now, we have not been able to actually visualize those processes. With technology, with tasks that are accurately designed to scaffold the thinking process into steps and to visualize what students do, we can get into this evidence. And this will not just give us better evidence for not just the knowledge, but the practices. And in any good common core, you have this distinction between basic knowledge and actual practice. For example, in science, what you know is the knowledge, you know a certain concept. The practice is scientific inquiry, the capacity to conduct scientific investigation. And for now, we have not been able to measure the practice well. By developing complex tasks that takes not 6 hours, because we cannot afford that, but 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and are accurately scaffolded, we can look into these practices, and we can use process data, log data, to make sense of this. But it requires quite a lot of work. And so we are trying, and we hope in like maybe next year, maybe we can show some advances we are doing. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, Mário. Por gentileza, Chico, então.
Thank you, Mario. So Chico now. I just wanted to reinforce Alice, and I couldn't agree more with Mario, but I would like to insist that all of that is very far from the school. We literally need thousands of tasks and activities related to the Common Core that will interpret the Common Core correctly. We're doing something crazy. We're giving orders, we're giving commands, and we are not making them concrete. We have to look at Pisa and look at Chile, as Ximena said, look at the 2 American consortia. They have so many examples. Our schools cannot do that for several reasons, but the biggest reason is that our schools are addicted to the metric being used so far. When we talk about texts, our texts in Brazil have 30 words. The PIL's text has 100, 150 words. The level of complexity of texts have to be considered. So our system, even before measuring, along with the assessment, we have to give concrete examples to schools. What does it mean? We have a generation of people who are addicted to to a text that requires superficial evidence. Changing the test alone, as we said we had with Pisa for schools, we will see that what we consider to be excellent is not even good. But we are not doomed to failure. We need a lot of assessment, but an assessment that will help teachers and schools. But we also need assessments that will allow you to manage the system. But those two things cannot be contradictory. We are at a moment in life where we are forgetting learning. Our students will not acquire higher skills. Why? Because we are not asking for it. We need to give concrete examples of what the Common Core requires and implement that at schools, and obviously conduct assessments accordingly. I don't see any difference between teaching for learning and teaching for a test. I think they are supplementary, but that's a different level of learning, really. I think the country deserves and needs it. Excellent comment, Chico. Thank you so much. Ximena, would you? Thank you, Alice. I agree with Mario and Chico. I think what Mario said is important, and I wanted to reinforce it. Transparency in disclosing what will be assessed. That is key, because that will allow us to think about how we will implement the Common Core in order to achieve our objectives. And our objectives need to be aligned. The Common Core needs to be alignment with the assessment. And that will allow teachers to know what to do in the classroom. So transparency in what will be assessed. And number two, I remember that at the CONCED meeting in Recife last year, Alexandre said this: listen, we will bring somebody from each education secretariat to co-design with us, and the participation of the school networks, people who are in the front line of education, they need to be engaged in that process. That's point number two. And point number three, again, excessive assessment won't give you a different result. I don't know how else to say it. We need to be creative. If we already have an assessment every 2 years at INEP, the year in between, what can we do? Let's be creative. Let's assess higher skills. Let's use other ways to assess students. So to assess 3 times or 4 times won't change the results, but we can use different types of assessments in order to see if we are achieving the Common Core objectives. Thank you very much, Ximena. With that, we have to conclude our panel because unfortunately we didn't have much time. We could spend hours discussing such an important topic. So I would like to close this panel bringing 2 points raised by our panel members. One, Marcia, present in our discussion, says, our focus has to be actual learning. That has to be our guide. And Luana also said something very important. She said, now that we already have high learning expectations at our Common Core and the curricula implemented by states and municipalities, we have to produce or to require more concrete evidence in our assessment. The assessment system has to be different. It has to integrate different tools, different actors, and ultimately, we have to answer that question. What is our focus? Our focus has to be students learning. Once again, I would like to thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Mario, Ximena, and Chico Soares. and the Lemann Foundation for organizing such an important meeting, such a necessary discussion. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mario. Thank you, Jimena and Chico, for your contributions. It is now time for our second panel. Part assessment as an ally of teachers, students as schools prepare to reopen. And today we have Joanne Caddy, a Pisa leader for schools at OECD, Frederico Amancio, the Secretary of Education from the state of Pernambuco, and also coordinates the assessment front at Undime, and Mariana Castro, the president of ABAVI, and Katia Small, director of the Reúna Institute. To facilitate the panel, we have Tiago Tobias, executive secretary from the Collaborate movement.
Good morning, bom dia.
Is Tiago here with us?
Good morning.
Yes, I am. Morning. Good morning, Tiago. And we also would like to call Joanne to start the presentation.
Thank you. Obrigada. Good morning, everybody, dear colleagues in Brazil. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to be sharing some insights from our learnings from working closely with Brazil over the last 2 years. The theme of my presentation will be very much about how data and how PISA frameworks can really empower school leaders and teachers. And so if we could go to the next slide, I would simply like to give you some background information about PISA for schools. I think the previous panel gave us a lot of information about how important this moment is in the Brazilian context. But it's not just in Brazil. And I think the importance of PISA for schools as a project run by the OECD is really to try and connect schools themselves, both within countries and internationally. I'd like to also very much recognize the members of this panel, several of whom have a very active role in PISA for schools. I'd like to thank Marielena for her guidance and leadership, and also to recognize the Secretary of Education, Amancio, because we really have appreciated working closely with schools across Brazil. My presentation will be brief, but it will focus probably less on assessment and more about post-assessment. What do we do when we do have data? But let me just begin by saying that the vision and mission of our project is really to make sure that excellence in teaching and learning is available to all children. So the emphasis on equity that PISA has at the international level for nation states is also for us. Could I go to the next slide, please? So very briefly, the PISA for Schools assessment is focused on the same age group as the main PISA survey, 15-year-olds who have completed or near to completing their secondary education. We used exactly the same protocols as PISA. The test itself is based on the PISA frameworks. The items, the questions, are unique to the PISA-based test for school. They're not the PISA items, but we have just recently completed an international linking study just in this last year, which further consolidates the link between the PISA scales and the PISA for schools. It's a 2-hour test, just as it is for PISA, and it covers science, maths, and reading. There's a 30-minute student questionnaire, which is extremely important. It is the student voice, where the students talk about their home situation. We are able to understand their socioeconomic background, and we're also able to understand their motivations for learning and their experience of classrooms and their schools for questions such as bullying and how they feel about their own learning. We have the test available in 10 languages, and it's now available in 13 countries. If you go to the next slide, you can see that there's a lot of the globe covered, but it's not as much as PISA. Brazil is a leading partner and a leading forerunner in the PISA for Schools project. Next slide, please. And to date, we've delivered the test to over 5,000 schools around the world. This slide is simply to reinforce the point that Pisa for schools, like the main Pisa test, is a competence-based assessment. It is trying to understand what students can do with the knowledge they have, applying it in novel contexts. Just as the Pisa frameworks provide an assessment for countries on the performance of entire countries, the Pisa for schools assessment provides an assessment for the entire school. And they are comparable. In Brazil, we started in 2017 with a pilot. I would like to thank and appreciate Lemann Foundation's great leadership and insight in helping to bring the Pisa for Schools assessment to Brazil. It started small, with about 46 schools taking part in the paper-based assessment. And we've continued the work with the Rio Foundation in the most recent edition in 2019, where we delivered the assessment to 228 schools from all over Brazil in 27 units of the Federation, and with a good mix of 3/4 of the schools being public and 1/4 that were private. What's important to note about the 2019 edition was that it was a digital assessment, and also that the content included some important measures of social-emotional skills. And if there's one thing we've all learned as we're all locked down in our respective countries, and that students are facing enormous difficulties to continue their learning journeys, it's that social-emotional skills are very important. They're not a nice to have, they are essential. So what we've been doing in the future is we've been looking at very much investing in post-assessment work. Next slide, please. Because we know that the work, next slide again, the work doesn't stop, right? When the data is delivered to the doorstep of schools, that's when the real work begins. And we recognize that. The Pisa for Schools project is a means to an end. It's not assessment for assessment's sake. And this means a couple of things for us. We're working very hard to create an online community for participating schools. We've also done a great number of dissemination activities and webinars to create a lot of dialogue between different schools. Next slide, please. Here, just for example, is some insights into our online community, which is a place which can be personalized by language. So any school that has done Pisa for Schools and has taken the assessment and that has received their school report, which is a fulsome 80-page packed with the data report, are also invited to take part in this professional learning community. The multilingual support that we have provided is as good as Google Translate can be, but it does provide an important aspect, which is that teachers and school leaders can use their own language. And as I like to say, the tyranny of the English language for international work is subverted by this type of technology. And it's very important for professional learning communities to be able to reach across borders using your own language. We have a lot of material in Brazilian Portuguese. We have a reader's guide, which is very important in terms of buttressing and supporting school leaders' understanding of data. And we need to really grapple with the level of data literacy present amongst school leaders and teachers. We have also invested a lot in doing case studies. Next slide, please. Just as an example, and here we have small photos of two of my colleagues, Mike Se and Thiago Fragoso, who have led several webinars with participating schools. And the level of interaction has been quite phenomenal, and extremely fine-tuned and very accurate questions have been put to the OSD team directly by the participating schools who want to understand their data better. Next one, thanks. And these are available online. I'd like to just share with you one very exciting peer learning mentoring discussion between two leading professionals, which we recently hosted. A former school teacher and former school principal from the United States who works in the superintendent's office of Gwinnett County near Atlanta in Georgia in the US, with the principal of high school in Rio de Janeiro. And what was interesting about this exchange between these two very experienced professionals, one from the US, one from Brazil, who had both become familiar with and appreciated the Pisa for Schools reports, was the depth of their inquiry of each other, and that the Pisa for Schools international benchmark function, by being connected to Pisa, by being able to compare the school's performances in
Podendo
reading, math,
comparar o desempenho das escolas em
would be
leitura
able
e
to
matemática.
would be able to actually actually be able to do their discussions. Next slide, please. We also had a very important conversation with Francisco Freire from Sobral, and this was an important and relevant discussion for many schools around the world about how to serve the most disadvantaged students. How can we truly provide quality education for all students? And what was interesting there as well is the number of teachers that tuned in from Brazil, from Colombia, Spain, and the US. So as we can see, the experience of Sobral is not just of interest in Brazil, but also internationally. Next slide. Thank you. So one of the key learnings that we have taken away from this in-depth work of post-assessment support to schools is that there are a lot of very, very good practices, but that the data that comes from the school is the school report that we provide is truly a catalyst for some important conversations. And Gwinnett County, for example, identified that they had lower maths and science scores than they had expected or that they had wanted, and that they were able, on that basis, to do a lot of summer schools with their teachers to introduce the idea of competence-based items and complex problem-solving skills, just as the members of the previous panel were talking about. And all of this work goes through teachers. It will not be done simply at the federal level in the United States or in Brazil, indeed. It will be happening at the school level. So the other aspect is the issue of motivation for learning. So they saw that their students didn't really understand why they should be learning maths and science. And this is important. Why am I learning this material? Why am I trying to apply this in my life? So these questions are provided through the data through Pisa for Schools. The next one, please. What we have also understood is the importance of leadership. That's the next slide. Thank you. And leadership comes not just at the school level, but also the importance of public policy support. So the example from Sobral is very, very important from many points of view, because it shows how important it is to involve not just the teaching community, because Francisco Freire made a lot of efforts to divulgate and disseminate the school results, not just in the school itself, but also with parents and the local authorities. And on the basis of that, they launched in-depth training for their teaching staff on competence-based approaches to mathematics, and also introduced peer learning among students. So these are some of those insights that we need to marry in-depth investigations of experience in schools with comparative data. We feel that this is a very powerful way of encouraging schools to take ownership of their learning and their improvement. Next slide, please. And there are three main issues that emerge, I think, from our work with Brazil. We'd like to offer them to the panel and to the discussion afterwards. The first one is that leadership is important. School leaders play a key role in both welcoming and helping others understand data, but also that the teacher professional development is a key element for any improvements. And the third one is the importance of, as we are here today with this event that Lemann Foundation is organizing, every country needs to explore the interactions and intersections between competence-based approaches and curricula. Thank you very much. The future is going to be interesting. I'd like to share one last slide with everybody about what our plans are. We have, of course, had to interrupt the provision of Pisa for Schools in Brazil at the moment, as in many countries, but we hope to return as soon as possible. In the meantime, we're working very hard to expand the number of items and time spent by students in the student questionnaire on social emotional skills. We will be introducing into Pisa for Schools the entire set of questions that our colleagues in the OECD survey of social emotional skills have developed. Not least, the Pisa team has very, very quickly pulled together and validated a global crisis module. These are a set of questions that will be introduced in the next Pisa round in Pisa 2022, but it is already publicly available, and I would draw your attention to this material, which is for public use for schools or local authorities. Pisa for Schools will be offering these questions in our next use of Pisa for Schools, which will be very important in helping schools understand the impact on students, not just their learning gaps that have been created, but also their well-being. And finally, as we've had Mario on our team, his team has published the results of the Global Competence Assessment, which will also soon be available in the Pisa for Schools instrument. So I'd just like to thank you for this opportunity to share what we have learned and how grateful we are to everyone that we've worked with in Brazil, and will continue to do so. Thank you very much. Thank you, Thiago.
Obrigada, Joane. A Joane volta depois para se conectar com o mediador, o Thiago e o...
Thank you, Joanne. Joanne will be back later to join us in our discussion. Now we have Frederico Amancio, who's Education Secretary from Pernambuco, and he coordinates the assessment front. Mr. Secretary, good morning. He's on mute.
Secretário, o senhor está me ouvindo?
Mr. Secretary, I think you are on mute. Good morning. Okay, now I'm on. Can you hear me all right? Okay. So good morning, Adriana. Good morning, Thiago. Good morning, Joanne. Good morning, our dear Maria Elena and Katia. It's a pleasure to be here sharing this panel with you. A big thank you to the Lemann Foundation and all other partners. It is a pleasure to be here to talk about such an important topic. Not only in the broader context, as it was said in the previous panel, but also now that we are now implementing the new Common Core and what we have lying ahead of us in the future, the innovations in Saeb and our assessment system in Brazil. But also we need to look at the current context, which is the main point of this panel, right? We're talking about getting ready to reopen schools and go back to school. I'd like to make a few comments along those lines so that I can perhaps contribute with this discussion, with this debate. I was very glad to watch Joanne's presentation as she kicked off the panel, talking about Pisa for Schools. Our panel talks about how assessments can become allies, can become partners to managers, students, and teachers. And I'd like to add a broader context, the context of the schools as a whole. For a long time here in Brazil, and we talked a lot about the assessment system here, the Saeb, our system used to be a summative model, more focused on systems. As time went by, and Joanne showed that it is possible to have a large-scale assessment with a broader look that would include schools. So the Pisa for Schools has this look at schools. Here in Brazil, with all our tradition, our history around assessment systems, and we have different states doing their own assessments, their own systems, large-scale systems, and they looked at the network as a whole. But throughout time, they started being used to provide support to schools. So especially state schools, they moved from being a larger scale system to systems that would provide support more locally to schools. to helping schools plan their activities, not only strategically speaking, but also from the point of view of pedagogy. So Pernambuco, my state, we have been working around that for more than 10 years. We use large-scale assessments to provide support to schools more locally. But of course, we've always felt an issue when we moved from Saeb as a larger system, and we look at systems that provide support to schools. And then we had been working, and those of you who know me, you know I've been working on this for a long time, when we created this assessment front with professionals from all over Brazil. And together, along with other partners providing support to us, we have been discussing different local assessments so that we can move ahead as a whole. And we have realized that possibilities are very large, many things that can be done. So it was already in our radar, in our planning for 2020, even before the pandemic. We were hoping to start a deeper work around assessments from the formative point of view. In other words, we were hoping to be able to use assessment to look at schools' everyday routines. We already had a few experiences in Brazil coming from states where they were working with diagnostic assessments conducted early in the year so that they could look at the students, at classes, classrooms, and schools. And all of that helped the schools prepare their planning. So, as I said, several schools already do that using those large-scale systems. And then at our front, the assessment front, we were trying to consolidate all that throughout the year. And we brought in another tool, not only to be used by teachers isolatedly. Our objective is to look at assessment at a broader angle, to have an approach so that that assessment is linked to the network's strategies. It's going to be used by schools, by teachers, but in line with what the network has planned. Schools, classrooms cannot evolve isolatedly. So we were thinking about that early on. So that's why I have strong faith in those partnerships, partners such as Lemann and others. But we also partnered with CONSEDI and other federal level organizations. Then in last March, we were hit by the lockdown, by the remote learning within the pandemic, and we had to reinvent ourselves, both in pedagogy, both in everyday activities, both in building new projects. It was a challenge across the world, and in Brazil in particular, all the states, all the more than 5,000 cities that we have, a large challenge for everyone. And then we started to try and find ways to support that process, not only throughout the pandemic, but afterwards. So within this context of remote learning, we thought we could also start planning the post-pandemic phase. That's in this context, this project emerged, this project of a learning support platform. And the idea is to allow the networks to conduct a diagnosis, and our secretary, Cecilia, is very much involved in that, so that this can already be discussed as we are having remote classes. We need to know how much students have come along so that we can plan activities going forward. So the assessment right now is also important, so that we can also address deficiencies and possible gaps that may have been created during the pandemic. And with that, we have created and developed several concepts that will be very helpful for schools, schools going forward, actually. Things that are now being used strategically by the network will then be used by schools in a more everyday, practical manner. So that platform is here to help teachers in that respect and schools in that respect. And it's very much in line with, as I said, the broader model. And of course, the CONSED has emphasized the importance of assessment of diagnosis as we prepare to reopen schools. We need to know how much remote learning worked so that we can help plan for the post-pandemic world, so that we can perhaps recover whatever was left behind. And then for that, we need to look at different schools. Perhaps the schools can look at each student and try to involve and engage everyone in the process. That's the view from the National Education Council, which is shared across at the municipal and state level. So that's why we've been providing all possible support, all support that we can to this platform, because we know the challenges are huge. The idea is to, as I said, look at 2021 as a year of recovery. And we also see this as a good opportunity to take to the networks some concepts of a formative assessment, so that this type of formative assessment can become part of schools' everyday activities, not isolated on a one-off basis, but the whole school, the whole teachers, everybody engaged in a project which is first launched by the network. If this was already important in a broader environment in the past, right now, as we're going through a pandemic, the relevance of that project has become even greater. In our opinion, we need to look at the networks and the schools with the same level of importance, and looking at the world in a future, in a post-pandemic world. So this combination of having a diagnostic assessment to check what the schools have done until now, the school level, student level, network level, very, very important. And we are already doing that, using diagnostic tests, assessments for both the periods pre-pandemic and all the way to now, right? In some of the schools here in the States, we have already reopened schools for classes, but we need to look beyond that. We need to see what we can do in this last couple of months of the year, but actually focus on what's coming forward. We need to follow up on that process very closely to strengthen the whole network. Our view today at CONSED and Undini is that this is important as we reopen schools for in-person classes. It's important so that you can also plan and perhaps contemplate hybrid teaching. Several cities will continue to have remote activities, even in this period. So it is also an opportunity to link with this broader view that I mentioned, which encompasses including the new Common Core initiatives. So the idea is to strengthen the use of assessments in schools' everyday activities as an activity to build and work around the planning going forward. But as it was said before, the success of all of that is directly linked to how much we can engage schools and networks. We've had good experiences across the country, but as I said, using large-scale assessments. And now, given the context of the pandemic, we have different challenges. We need to plan for activities going forward, and we need to articulate all those learnings, all those insights, and to be able to better address deficiencies and gaps that were caused during this period. And we believe this is going to be very important to have a diagnosis so that we can start looking at assessment. There are several other important aspects as we increase our support to schools, networks. So I invite you all to get to know this support platform that we have provided schools and networks to see all the other aspects and dimensions. I'd like to thank all our partners, CAED, the Reúna Institute, and other partners. A special thank you to all our partners who have helped us put this learning platform together. It's a very important step to improve assessment in Brazil. And the last step is coming soon, and it will allow us to evolve across the board. Thank you, and I'll talk to you later. Thank you, Tiago. Thank you, Secretary.
Now, in order to continue our debate, we will turn it over to Maria Helena, the president of ABAV. Good morning. Good morning, Adriana. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. I'm really impressed with this seminar. I want to thank the Lemann Foundation and the OECD, and ABAV, the institution I preside, is honored to be a partner in such an important seminar to discuss the frontiers of assessment in elementary education in Brazil. Out of everything that I heard from the very beginning until now, what is clear is the following. Brazil has a gigantic agenda ahead because on the one hand, we have a structural agenda to implement the Common Core and to restructure our national assessment system. And on the other hand, a very short-term target to reopen our schools and prepare our schools to reopen. So I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to the Lemann Foundation for allowing us to hold this type of debate. And also, everyone who has participated so far, as we heard in the previous panel. Now with Fred, Katia as well, who has done an extraordinary work at Reúna, and Tiago from the Colabora movement. And I also see Inés Alexandre and Joanne. It's very nice to see you, Joanne. Knowing that we had those two agendas, and my mission here is to talk about the immediate agenda, what to do now with the schools. I understand that the biggest challenge that we face will be to take a look at the enormous inequalities that we experienced during the pandemic. Why do I say that? Well, actually, educational inequalities in Brazil have always been there. Last year, PNAD 2019 conducted a survey that showed clearly the size of education inequality in Brazil in 2019, before the pandemic, emphasizing that 28.9% of students 15 to 17 years of age dropped out of school, either because they were not interested or because they needed to work. So that was last year. Imagine this year during the pandemic, the size of that percentage. We have no idea of the impact of that trend, students dropping out in this moment of isolation. And we spent over 7 months away from schools. And more recently, we had a survey conducted by the Getúlio Vargas Foundation, FGV, coordinated by Marcelo Neri. And their work was really incredible, estimating the time dedicated to studies comparing online activities offered since May in every Brazilian state in the capital and metropolitan regions, comparing public and private schools. And the result is terrible. Students from social classes A and B, higher income brackets in private schools in August 2020 were having on average 4 hours, or rather 4.5 days of classes during the isolation period per day, And per day, they almost have almost 4 hours of school activities, be them online or offline. Public school students on average were having on average 2 hours of classes or school activities per day. Besides, the study showed that, for instance, while states like Sao Paulo, Santa Catarina, Paraná, in the southeast and in the south of Brazil, and some in the northeast, were offering face-to-face classes to high school students. And some states, like in the north, the state of Pará, 62% of students 15 to 17 years of age had no online activity during social distancing and had no access to that activity. So how are we going to reopen our schools, taking in mind those inequalities? That will require a lot of support. Fred mentioned the platform in the state of Pernambuco, and that is an essential tool to help us face those inequalities as schools reopen. We have to consider the local characteristics. So the National Education Council, the other hat I wear, brings very important recommendations to schools. The first of which is that diagnostic assessment during the social distancing period is important to understand where students stand, what have they learned, what have they developed during the period schools were closed. Have they developed new competencies, or were they managed to follow the activities that were offered? That was an initial assessment showing us where students stand, and that's very important in that reopening process that is beginning now in some Brazilian states and others that will only resume face-to-face classes in 2021. Apart from that formative assessment, and especially as we heard before by Chico, by Mario, and by Ximena, what do we do to provide feedback to our students? We have to provide accurate diagnosis to support them. And also, we need to provide feedback to teachers, because teachers are those that will face an enormous challenge moving ahead back in the classrooms. Our teachers should know how to organize or reorganize the quote unquote new school. And starting with that feedback, teachers should be able to develop new face-to-face and online activities using focus maps, using the identification of skills and competencies that are most essential, using existing platforms. Why do I say that? Because another study conducted by the Peninsula Institute showed that 87% of our teachers do not know what to do with online activities. They have a hard time considering how to assess the students when they resume classes. And I have one more message. And I think this is the position of ABAV and the National Education Council to recommend that schools do not fail any student. This is not a prohibition, but there is a strong recommendation. Our students have already been seriously affected in 2020. So failure will have an even stronger impact on them, the meaning of exclusion. And if we want to include our students as schools reopen, if we want to avoid dropout and actively convince them to go back to schools, we cannot convey that message of failing them. We have to give them the possibility of catching up, of learning everything that they couldn't, getting to the end of 2021 fully capable of learning and developing their school journey. And finally, another recommendation that I have will go to the summative assessments at this end of year, especially to those students that are in the final years. We know that students that are in the first, second, fifth, and ninth grade or third year of high school, they face more complicated challenges than those that are not in those grades that are so strategic in the learning process. The initial years require an individual assessment of the students and a personal individual plan for them to catch up so that they don't build difficulties. And our recommendation for the fifth and ninth grades is that schools only conduct an assessment for certification purposes. Giving them enough opportunity to catch up, learning all skills and competencies that are expected from them. I would like to conclude with those final messages. So first, we should understand the enormous diversity that we have in Brazil, the enormous inequalities, to know how to act as our schools reopen and how to use assessments, especially to help include and improve the learning process of every student. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor. We have many challenges ahead. That's why all these thoughts are very important. Our next guest is Katia Smol, the president of the Reúna Institute. Katia, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Adriana. I would like to say it is an honor to be here with so many people dedicated to discussing education in a panel with so many scholars, with so many experts in assessment, so many people dedicated to changing education in this country, and with so dear friends in this panel. I would like to say it is a pleasure. And what a challenge it is to speak about assessment in a coherent system after so many presentations that were made before me, but I will try and talk a little about the school and the teachers. I think everyone has already said about the importance of having a common core, but I would like to underscore a point, because the common core places learning at the very core, and it changes a process that we had in the past. We had an assessment before having a common core, and with that, we had a period of confusion. Sometimes large-scale assessments or large-scale matrices were confused with the curriculum, and there were distortions in the past. At least in the fifth and ninth grades and in the third year of high school, we just taught students to take assessments. in those years where large-scale assessments were conducted. I think we gained a lot with the arrival of the Common Core. I was an elementary education teacher for a long time, and the Common Core helps teachers answer another question after all. When this year ends, what is it that my students will have to have learned? So the Common Core gives us a substantial gain and it gives us a mission of ensuring equity with quality in our students' learning process. However, it sheds light on another need. And this is present in the 2017 and 18 resolutions of the National Education Council. We must have an alignment of teacher training, the Common Core, and the assessment. We have seen that process evolve, and today, everyone who spoke before me spoke about the need of aligning the assessments, especially summative assessments, with the expectations, the right to learn, and the characteristics of our Common Core. But I would like to go back to a point that has to do with the teacher training, how to teach teachers for summative assessment. We can improve large-scale assessments and improve learning results, but how can we do that if our teachers are not better trained to conduct the assessment that really matters, which is continuous assessment that takes place in the classroom? We may have excellent teaching materials, we may have excellent large-scale assessments, we can have a lot. However, the assessment that takes place in the classroom needs to be consistent with all the innovation brought about by the Common Core. We usually said that teachers have a hard time. I have discussed that a lot when I work with teachers. And what's the difference between learning things and having difficulties? Nobody teaches what they don't know. Nobody does what they don't know. We create fads, and we believe that overnight, our teachers, just because we came up with a good idea, our teachers will be able to implement them just because we had a good idea. We talked about continued progressions, cycles of learnings, and growth mindset, neuroscience, integral development. And we believe that overnight, our teachers and educators will do all that. It won't happen, really. So that training for a summative assessment is a challenge. It is a challenge to the networks. It is a challenge because we need to support teachers. Because there is so much that needs to be done. The problem is not that you don't know how to do it, it's a learning challenge. I believe that the teacher training program, whenever it is implemented in pedagogy schools, will be an evolution. That's one of the innovations. It's one of the assumptions of our Common Core. But we have over 2 million teachers in continued education. They have to learn how to assess students. The challenge for this school is that whenever we talk about summative assessment in the schools, it includes 3 dimensions. It's diagnostic, it is formative, and it's summative. In that sense, every time that as a teacher I conduct an assessment, we collect the data, we analyze the data, and based on that data analysis, we should ask, what then? What do I do with that data? When I ask that question, I'll start planning interventions. And those interventions will allow me to plan. And that's an art. And it's a map, whereas assessment is just a compass so that our boat doesn't go any direction. The assessment in the classroom is continuous. In the summative and diagnostic assessment, you have just part of the assessment. But for the educator, formative assessment has a triple role: diagnostic, summative, and formative. It depends on good tools, being able to ask good questions, the relationship between teaching and learning, working conditions, didactic experience, technical knowledge. So teacher training today is heavily focused on the specific knowledge of a curricular component, but that is not enough. In a coherent system, we need to understand not only what I teach and to whom I teach, but how do I assess? How do I transform questions into interventions? And we have to be careful with some jargons. For instance, I don't like the idea of recovery or reinforcement lessons. So reinforcement lessons doesn't talk to learning principles. Reinforcement is something of the past, and the idea of intervention means to look at now to produce a virtuous learning cycle. This country excludes a lot, and this is something that didn't begin now. There was a lot that was not learned. So based on everything that is happening now, we have to support an assessment system that will support learning, that will support teachers. We need to create strategies that will support learning. Teachers are now facing a gigantic challenge. They cannot face all those challenges by themselves. I think planning will be important, support to teachers, and that will require a collective effort along with teachers. I have said on other occasions, and some of you may have heard me, if I could, I would include two messages to our education system. Nobody can pass without knowing what they don't know, and nobody should we shouldn't fail anybody if we didn't allow them to learn. And summative assessment has to be a very relevant tool in that activity. But we all need to support schools and teachers so that they know how to do that. That's what I wanted to say. And I wanted to end with words of gratitude to the Reúna team, because they have helped me tremendously so that today we could be here having this discussion. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you, Katia. I'd now like to call Tiago Tobias, who's going to facilitate the panel discussion. He's the Executive Secretary of the Colabora Movement, and he also has a couple of insights. Tiago, we have the floor. Good morning. I'd like to thank the Lemann Foundation for putting together the seminar. I'd like to thank Professor Joanne, Secretary Marilena, Fred, and also Katia, my colleagues here. I think a word that could summarize the panel is equality with quality. I see the importance of applying Pisa for schools when you see schools across the world which are also using virtual environments to exchange experiences together with the Pisa experience and all that being brought to Brazil. As Professor Tomás said in the chat box, this was used in the state of Ceará, and they had very good results of that combination. We also heard Professor Fred saying of the importance of assessment to provide strategic guidelines to the networks and to schools as a way to support the strategy of both schools and network. Professor Katia reinforced the importance of assessments in the classroom, diagnostic tests, formative assessments, and lastly, I'd like to touch upon Professor Maria Lena's. She's thinking about the current moment, the reopening of schools, and along with the Common Core. I think it's very important to look at things in a more structured way. There is a challenge ahead of us. It's a global challenge, and we need to face the reopening challenge now. But we also have an educational agenda which has been thought about, worked. We have just seen the approval of Fundab. We have the new Common Core. So there is an agenda in place. It's a concern with the whole. So it's important to put those things together. And as I move to the question phase of the panel, I'd like to pick up where some of the presentations left off. When we think about this broader assessment scenario, which would be the assessments? Which would be the assessments that could help, and which assessments could hinder classwork or the work or the life in the classroom? We see a lot of innovation, a lot of technology, but what does help and what does hinder? So I'd like to hear from each and every one of you, what do you think? Starting with Joanne, please.
Thank you, Thiago, for an excellent framing of what we all want, which is equity and quality. But I think Maria Elena was very, very right to sound the alarm about the enormous risk of dropout, not just in Brazil, but all around the world. And so I think perhaps more than ever, we really need to focus on the most vulnerable students in our systems, try to really get our heads around what it is that they've experienced and are continuing to experience in order to offer appropriate measures to reach them where they are. The OECD has done a great deal of what I would call emergency response policy analysis in the hasty 6 or 7 months that have just come behind us to try and see what countries are doing all around the world, what local authorities, what state authorities and federal authorities are trying to do around the world to face what is a common challenge, which is learning gaps that won't just be fixed with a couple of remedial lessons, but actually require probably much wider coalitions of communities, families, parents, schools, and local authorities. And I think as we are in an event looking at assessment, I think we need to be lucid about what are the limits, but also the strengths of a well-chosen assessment. And I would just bring your attention to two, really both of which are incorporated in the Pisa for Schools project. The first one is this enormous emphasis on the socioeconomic background of the students that are in a particular school. In many countries, there is incidental or additional information, and of course, school principals know very well the neighborhoods that they are serving. But this instrument really does capture what it is that students are struggling with as a baseline. The second aspect is social-emotional skills. The ability to communicate, the ability to problem solve, the ability to self-regulate has never become more powerfully important than ever before. And I think this is where we really need to devote a lot of attention to understanding if students have the skills they need to learn. under whatever circumstances, whatever disruptions. And this is also an aspect where some of the OECD work on social emotional skills has really, I think, come into its own. The time is now right to take a critical but in-depth look at what already exists amongst the various assessment materials and put them to good use. So I just want to say that the OECD team stands behind every one of you on this panel and those watching who are in the front line of this battle to keep from losing an entire generation of students. And we're very committed, so please call on us. Thank you, Trevor.
Okay, Professor Fred.
Okay, Professor Fred now. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Joanne. Now, Professor Fred. Okay, a few comments about your question, Tiago. Even though we have this long-standing tradition about summative assessment, I think that for this year, specifically for 2020, I think it should be placed as a priority. This is a even year. We do not have Saeb, but we do have local assessments. So that's the main priority for this year. And this will lay bare what we already know. We have had learning difficulties, learning gaps, but we won't have a more specific look at the students that will lead to better planning. It will bring those losses to light, first and foremost. For 20, or for this, the current process as we prepare to reopen, we did an assessment of how the remote learning process, where does it stand at this point while we wait for schools to really reopen. So an instrument that would be important right now are diagnostic assessments, because they look specifically at the school, to the classroom, and to the students. With that, you will be able to provide the right support in school as they plan for the near future. And we do have significant differences between schools in the same network. And of course, students also differ. And that goes for both private and public schools. Even private school students had difficulties now. So that diagnostic assessment will help networks plan, help schools plan at the class level. And that could even perhaps provide support to students who need more specific support for next year, for 2021. It's also an interesting moment that we could try and explore and strengthen our work around summative assessments. And formative assessments are not enough. I am a strong believer in engaging teachers, but also engaging the school and the network. I do believe in integrating all those three levels for us to advance as a group, as a whole. So not so much for this year, but for 2021, I think summative assessments will have or play an important role, so that after we try and recover learnings that were lost for 2021, then we'll be able to have a clearer perception of where we are. Now, focusing on summative assessments should not be our first priority. At the end of next year, at the end of 2021, where we'll have local systems getting in place, the new Saeb, that will be more helpful, and we'll have a better look of the whole system, the whole network, and of the work that will have been done throughout 2021. So priority now is to look at a diagnostic assessment, because it will help schools plan and prepare for the post-pandemic time and for reopening. Thank you, Professor Fred, Professor Helena. Hi, Tiago. Thank you for your question. I agree with what my colleagues have said, Joanne, Fred. I also agree with the presentations that were given. Thank you for that. Something that calls my attention and is a sort of some concern for me is to adopt one single assessment instrument to assess students as they go back to school, irrespective of what grade or class they are, irrespective of what network they are, because they will come back very, very different. So, whatever strategy we choose to adopt, we need to have clear in our minds that we are not dealing, or rather, that we're dealing with a completely abnormal situation, unpredictable situation. And because it is abnormal, we do not know yet how our students progressed or evolved along certain skills, if whether they were successful or not, or how successful they were. We need to be careful with excessive assessment. So, besides that, we need to have clarity to understand where students stand, where they are, and understand the multiple possibilities that will emerge. Uh, we are talking about a universe, a population of students that have evolved at different paces with different difficulties. So it is important to have an assessment that will help us understand where students stand, as I said, in terms of development, in terms of active pedagogy, so that everyone might become interested in learning again, in getting integrating and understanding the importance of education, because I'm sure this will happen. We do know that some students are dropping out. Others might come back and think that remote activities were even better than in person, and others that will come back and think that they have learned nothing. So this perception on the part of the school as schools reopen is essential, both in social emotional terms and in terms of cognitive learning and learning per se. At the same time, the main challenge for assessments next year, especially nationwide large scale assessments, will be to develop a type of work that will manage to deal with such a different, novel context. A moment we are now revisiting our own assessments here in Brazil. They have been very important for the past decades, but now they have to, or they should, align with the new Common Core as we assess new competencies, new skills that go way beyond competencies and skills that are currently measured by our Saeb. So we do have a year which is very, very challenging, a lot of work ahead of us, but also we need to pay attention that we have to be careful as our students go back to school, and we need to care for them. They will come back different. They'll come back to a place that will also be different for them.
Obrigado, professora Marilena.
Thank you, Professor Marilena, Professor Katia, for her final remarks.
Síntese, né?
I'll
Porque
try to summarize everything I've heard. I'm loving this. So many practical things to take home.
e tenho concordância com
I
todos.
agree with all of you, my colleagues here at the panel. When I hear Joanne said what she said, I am very excited about the Pisa for schools. I'm a big advocate of that. And I see that we have a challenge, which is a challenge about scale. This country has a big debt in terms of offering quality education to everyone. And I think we could look at this experience and the experience brought to us by Pisa for schools to try and understand what we could learn from it, to try and improve assessment processes in terms of data collection for our assessments. Even if you were not going to conduct assessments, summative assessments, as Freddie was mentioning. With Fred, I totally agree with Fred. I agree with the importance of diagnostic assessment. I think it'll draw a very important map for us to know where we are so that we can make the next step. And I agree with Maria Elena when she said that we, because of the age bracket of our students, because of the command that they have, we will need different instruments. And that takes me to my concern about formative assessment because of the following two dimensions. Starting with the diagnostic assessments, we might be using that to do our planning and at the same time to provide support to our teachers across those three dimensions. And then take an important step towards formative assessment. Because after that, we'll have a different diagnostic, think about data again, and then we'll think about a new plan to be able to conduct our interventions. Then, Maria Elena, we need to think about different instruments to help teachers to know, to get to know the best instruments. That will be very important, especially when we talk about a hybrid teaching that you mentioned in your presentation. I think it'll be quite important for us to work with different learning rhythms, learning paces. So will those focus maps will be very important. We'll need to be able to focus what really matters. The National Council of Education has said that they want us to make students advance, but they also want us to offer students the chance to have a 2-year period to recover. It's not doing something of what was not done in 2020 and try to recover hastily. We need to keep focus around that. We need to focus on essential learnings. The country has a very important mission, which is of implementing the reference curriculums, which were built upon the new Common Core. So reopening of schools is a big challenge. Supporting teachers, as Freddie said, is also a challenge, and we need to do that in a systematic manner, looking at the school, the classroom, and the network. And then I go back to what I said. We need a systematic approach. Look at the curriculum from a systematic point of view, from very focused points to make good choice in terms of didactic material, then have a combination of different assessments, formative, summative, diagnostic. All of that will provide the space for teachers to thrive. Thank you for your question, Tiago.
Uma vez, a professora
Thank you
Joane.
once again to Professor Joanne, Marilena, Fred, and Katia. Thank you all for participating, and we'll move on now for the next session. Thank you, Tiago. Yet another important panel with more insights, all within the frontiers of assessment. I have here with me Daniel De Bonis. He is the Educational Policies Director from the Lemann Foundation. Good afternoon, Daniel. We're coming to the last bit of our webinar. So Daniel is with me because we have come to our final session. And I'd like to invite Alexandre Pereira Lopes, the president of INEP, the National Institute of Educational Research, Mr. Teixeira, who will be talking about the future of Saeb. Thank you for your participation. I know you will facilitate the panel later. And now, good afternoon to our facilitator. Thank you. Can you hear me all right? I'd like to thank the Lemann Foundation, OCDE, a very important topic for education. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about the projects of the new Saeb. Saeb currently is applied every 2 years. It involves 2nd, 5th grade of middle school and the 2nd year of high school. Ever since it was created, it was created to be a systematic assessment. That's why it does not happen every year. It was more census based on student sample numbers. And that's why we consider it to be very, very important because it helped us put in place different targets. And our administrators are very focused on that. And now we're now looking at a new assessment cycle. And with that, we have a new Saeb. What is a new Saeb? It's a change in focus. We now want to take assessment closer to families, to the classroom, to school managers, and to teachers. And how are you going to go about that? We're going to use assessments every year, not only every 2 years. And it'll cover the whole elementary education. We'll start in the second grade, all the way through the third year of high school. All grades will be assessed now year on year. That's the new Saeb. And it covers all knowledge areas. We'll no longer be limited to Portuguese and maths. We'll be assessing other knowledge fields as well. And why are we doing this? Our objective is to take this feedback on a timely manner to all students. So now families will know how their kids are faring in the classroom, what kind of performance they have, on top of the individual report card. And teachers will know what kind of students they are receiving because they'll have the results for previous year's results. So teachers will be able to self-assess their class plans. And the same goes for principals, managers, administrators. They'll be able to better plan their school life cycle. And the exam will cover skills and competencies that were seen to be lacking in previous years. So we can provide, for example, remedial work for those deficiencies. Also important, with that data in hand, we can take that to local Secretary of Education, just as Fred said, who will be able to work on teacher training. And because they'll have identified what's happening inside the classroom, what kind of teacher training is necessary. So training could be customized in that respect.
And when does it start? The new Saeb will begin next year. Next year, we will have the regular Saeb in the fifth, ninth year, and the third year of high school. And next year, we will start assessing the first year of high school using the new Saeb. So next year, we'll begin with Saeb in the first year of high school. Next, in 2022, we will apply it to the second, third, fifth, and eighth grade of elementary education, first and second year of high school, and so on and so forth until we assess every grade. As we want that tool to reach every student should be assessed. So it's a census-based system. It's not information to pass on to the secretaries. So this work has to get to all schools. But the challenge of conducting a test with such a dimension in Brazil is so complicated. And to make it possible, we will begin applying digital tests. Next year, every year in the first year of high school, we'll take an assessment using a tablet. That's going to be the beginning of the new Saeb. Besides, in high school, the high school assessment in the first, second, and third year will make up a score that will be used to give them access to higher education, just like NM, what we call yearly NM. So yearly NM is Saeb for high school. So the students who will start the first year of high school next year will take the assessment at the end of the year at around October, and that grade will be able to be used to access higher education. So students can become more competitive taking that test and give them an extra opportunity to access higher education through that assessment. in the future, besides traditional NM that will still exist, we will have the yearly NM, expanding the options students have to access higher education. A very important aspect in that assessment in the high school system is the implementation of the new high school system with formative itineraries. With the National Council of Education, represented here by Maria Helena and CONSED, the National Council of Education Secretaries, we're working together, and Secretary Fred is participating in our discussions. Through that debate, through that cooperation between INEP, the Ministry, the National Education Council, and CONSED, we intend to implement the test next year. We will also want to improve the way the assessment is conducted, not just the digital platform, allowing us to prepare more complex items similar to what Pisa offers today. But in the first year of high school, we will introduce open-ended questions. So in the first test next year, we will have open-ended questions. That's something I can guarantee. A new way to better explore the evidence, as Professor Chico Soares mentioned, to improve the way we assess students. These are innovations that we want to bring to society using not only a new assessment model, but also we want to improve the way we produce that assessment to have better and faster results so that we can use those results in the classroom. That's it. It is a significant challenge. We are highly excited with that project. And besides, something else that is important, in order to implement that project, in a partnership with municipal and state secretaries, we have also talked to Undimi. We will bring teachers from municipal and state networks to work as interns at INEP, working with us. We will train them to prepare items. They will produce items that will be used at Saeb. They will also participate in our application logistics. NM is the test with the largest number of, the largest volume of resources. We will also have the Brazilian Sign Language available in this new assessment model. So the new Saeb is a bold project, very large, and we need the collaboration of states, municipalities, the academia, but I believe that this assessment will be very important to improve Brazilian education. And both the traditional Saeb and the new Saeb next year will also be an opportunity. Since it's census-based, it will be important for us to see the impact of the pandemic in the education system. It will be one more component that will help the country better understand our education system and how the pandemic affected our students. That will allow us to be able to solve the problems that were created. That's it. Thank you. Thank you, Alexandre. First of all, I want to thank you for participating today and for the opportunity of sharing with us that vision that INEP is bringing for the new Saeb. I would like to start our conversation asking you a question about a topic that was thoroughly discussed by the experts, which is the need to rethink about assessment paradigms in elementary education. How to assess higher skills and competencies, problem solving, besides the multiple choice tests, other ways of assessing students. While I listened to you, I thought to myself, this is a new and bold proposal because of its size, its complexity, its reach. to apply it to every grade and every year assessing every field of knowledge. Is it possible to combine the two in this large Saeb with a greater outreach? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And this is a topic of our technical discussion. That's why from the very beginning, we will use online or digital assessment. The new Saeb already starts being digital from 5th grade to the 3rd grade of high school. It's going to be digital. For the initial years, we understand that an assessment on paper will be better, but starting on the 5th grade, it will be digital. And we sort of free ourselves from the paper model that's been used for 100 years, and we can benefit from everything the technology can offer to develop better items. Not next year, not in 2021, but for 2022, the idea is that the new Saeb will use adaptative tests, no more traditional tests, but adaptative tests, where the computer will select the next question and we will be able to calculate proficiency more accurately. And we will be able to cover the matrix better with fewer items. It's an evolution in the way we assess. And besides, as I said, next year we will begin open-ended questions. Today, Saeb only uses multiple choice questions. Next year, we will introduce open-ended questions in the first year of high school. That's also an evolution. So this is what we are doing. As we will have a new cycle, we will have new assessment matrices, Saeb, along with experts, and also discussing with the ministry, CNE, Undime, and CONCED, we will develop new assessment matrices, the use of open-ended questions, the use of the digital platform to conduct the assessment, to prepare INEP for the future. We want to improve the quality of assessment. Great. Since you talked about the digital format, we know that connectivity is critical at our schools. We have a very low connectivity levels in Brazil. The same applies to devices available to everyone, and even to prepare teachers to use those digital devices. How does INEP see those challenges to implement a digital assessment in Brazil? Well, part of that logistical problem has been overcome. INEP already knows the schools, every public school in Brazil. We already apply tests in every school using the traditional Saeb. So this is knowledge we already have. The new Saeb, it's important to say, will also reach all private schools. That's something new. In the past, Saeb was only applied to public schools and was only a sampling method for private schools. That's why students will take the test using a tablet. We know that schools do not have enough technological resources. Even through our census, we know that. We know the situation of our schools. That's why, as we understand that the new assessment model will be important to improve quality, we couldn't expect schools to provide their technological infrastructure. We would be excluding those that do not have the necessary devices. And that's not what we want. We want an inclusive assessment. We want to bring everyone to the new model. So we will take tablets to the schools. So the private entity will take the tablets to schools. And the test will be encrypted on the device through a password. After, the private entity will take the devices to a center where there is connection. So that overcomes the problem of schools not having connectivity. We will take the devices to the schools. All right then. we are running out of time, and we have a last question. Once again, thank you very much for joining us today. You talked about your schedule. You said that the process has to be implemented gradually because it's quite bold and it involves many phases. Is this the official schedule? Will it be published by INEP? How could networks be prepared for that? As for the first year of high school, it's confirmed we will apply that test next year for all students in the first year of high school in every school in Brazil. The assessment matrices will be ready in January. We are already talking to CONSED and the National Education Council. We have held different meetings along the year. It's a joint effort. This is not something imposed by INEP. We are developing it together. We are following the schedule, and in January, we will have the matrix for the first year of high school, where we will assess only Portuguese and math. And then, but in the first year, just Portuguese and math. This is something we agreed upon with the ministry. For 2022, we will have tests for second, third, fifth, ninth grade, and then first and second years of the high school system. Every year, there will be a publication in the official gazette about the terms, the dates, and every year that will be done. But schools can already start preparing that. First year of high school, we will apply the new Saeb. Alexandre, thank you so much for participating in our webinar, for answering our questions. We do hope this debate will continue openly with broad participation. These are complex and important topics, and I'd like to turn it over to Adriana for our closing session. Thank you. Thank you, Alexandre. Thank you, Daniel. Well, during this morning, we talked to some experts, some of the best in the world, sharing ideas and trying to improve our public education. We hope this is not the end, but the beginning of an increasingly better debate on how to ensure that our assessment is increasingly able to help students, teachers, managers, and scholars to provide excellent and credible information to everyone. Good afternoon to everyone who joined us this morning. I hope you all have a very pleasant afternoon. Goodbye.